systems that we currently have in our region. That is for next week. And this webinar today is in the series, is a webinar in the series of webinars that we've held on our campaign on international justice mechanism around wage theft. And today's one is focused on business. But just to say, today we have also launched a petition, and I will ask my colleague Joe to very quickly share about the petition. Joanna? Joanna? All right, looks like Joanna's having problems connecting, or is Ayessa there? Okay, we'll come back to that. Looks like that there must be a connection problem, but we will. Ayessa, are you going to talk about the? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good evening to everyone. I'm Ayessa Nilong from Migrant Forum in Asia, and I'm here to share with everyone the petition we're launching as part of our wage theft campaign, Justice for Wage Theft. So it's been 2 months since the launch of our first appeal calling for the urgent mechanism for repatriated migrant workers during COVID-19. And as part of that, we're now launching a global petition called Say Yes to Justice. So this petition aims to raise our voices, our demands for governments to act and address the needs of migrant workers who have lost their livelihoods as a result of the pandemic and who have been forced to return home without being paid their dues, their benefits, and their salaries. So we reiterate in this petition our call to put in place justice systems that will address these wage theft cases, these large volumes of wage theft cases, and justly and without delay. So definitely it is high time that we no longer remain complicit to these injustices, and we no longer have to turn a blind eye to such an injustice. So we invite you all to join us in this call, and we would like you all to join us and say yes to justice. And with that, we would like to share with you a very short video on the petition, which my colleague will be sharing with you all through your screen.
There is problem of sound. Sound is not coming.
Yes. Yes to justice.
Oh, it's okay now.
COVID-19 has resulted in the loss of livelihood for millions of migrant workers.
More than 200,000 migrant workers have returned to Asia so far alone.
Women are among those who are most severely affected.
Many migrant workers have returned with nothing but a few belongings.
Others have returned deeply in debt.
Wage theft is a reality that has shaped the migration journey.
It's about time that we act together to ensure justice for migrant workers.
Today is the time we say yes to justice.
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 Yes to justice. Yes to justice.
Yes to justice.
All right, so
Right. So you will poster where you will find the link to the petition where you can sign on. And the link will also be shared on the chat box as well. So you can click on that and sign on right now. And you would like to call on everyone to sign the petition, share this petition, and raise the issue with your colleagues and your network through your online platforms and social media accounts. And we highly encourage everyone to use our hashtag say yes to justice. And we hope you can sign on and circulate this widely so that we can gather as much signatures as possible so we can strengthen our call to address the needs of repatriated migrant workers during this time. And as our colleague Lara Ibrahim said in the video, today is the time we say yes to justice. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us in today's discussion. We'll have the link to the petition in the chat box, so we hope you can click right now. And that's all from my end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ayessa, for that. So that's the second announcement we had. The first one was about the next webinar, which is on employer-tied systems. And the second announcement was about this campaign, the petition. We are inviting everybody to sign on. And then the highlight of today's announcements is that from September 1, we will be doing a 23-part series webinars every Tuesday, the same time, on the 23 objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. From September 1, a 23 series webinar every Tuesday around the same time on the Global Compact on Migration. We'll be sending out the links to that soon as well. So having said that and those announcements, let me now go to the topic of the day, and let me hand over to Datu Rama, who will moderate today's. Datu is very well known in the community of human rights and migrant rights activists in the region. He is an outstanding human rights lawyer in Malaysia. He's part of the migration working group. He's part of the Bar Council. He's been an advisor to the Malaysian government, the previous government. He's been part of various committees that have looked into migration governance in Malaysia. He's been also part of the Lawyers Beyond Borders and part of the ASEAN Bar Councils as well in trying to advocate and move the agenda on the protection of the rights of migrants and refugees. Datu's experience is very well known. He has taken up from on the ground many cases of migrant workers and brought justice to migrant workers in a very real way. So he knows the issue of bringing up from the ground and taking it to the highest policy level. His experience is unbounded, and we thank him for the time that he has given for us today in accepting to moderate this esteemed panel. Datu, over to you.
Thank you very much, William, and thank you for that kind words. I don't think so. I deserve all those accolades that you have given. Thank you very much again. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to this session or webinar on business and transitional justice. Of course, the word transitional justice is not a very common word. And like everybody else, I too Googled to check. So according to the International Center for Transitional Justice, it defines as follows, and I quote, transitional justice is rooted in accountability and redress for victims. It recognizes their dignity as citizens and as human beings. Ignoring massive abuses is an easy way out, but it destroys the values on which any decent society can be built. Transitional justice asks the most difficult questions imaginable about law and politics. By putting victims and their dignity first, it signals the way forward for a renewed commitment to make sure ordinary citizens are safe in their own countries, safe from abuses of their own authorities, and effectively protected from violation of others, unquote. That's what's defined by the International Center for Transitional Justice. Transitional justice very much depends on the context of the issues, whether it's conflict, it's internal strife. We've had cases of transitional justice. I think the most popular that we know of is the truth commissions that many societies have held. Those are the classic examples, the traditional examples of what transitional justice is all about. We've had it in South Africa, we've had it in Nepal, East Timor, and many other countries. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has now brought this issue of millions of migrant workers who are suffering a gross violation of labor rights on a large scale, including that very important issue of wage theft of millions of dollars to the detriment of workers, wherein there is no accountability by business as well as state actors. It has also been found that the existing dispute resolution mechanism has been inadequate. Therefore, this, and also one of the important things that is important is the role of business in ensuring the justice of migrant workers. So these are some of the issues that we'll be touching on. Civil society has made a call calling for a transitional mechanism, a transitional justice mechanism to be put in place, wherein migrant workers would be able to access their legal rights and justice can be delivered, legal remedies can be delivered. As I said before, there is a gross lack of accountability. There is a great deal of lack of access to justice, be it in countries of destination, be it countries of origin. So these are some of the many issues that we are facing today. There have been 3 appeals by Migrant Forum Asia, the civil societies, lawyers groups, and so on and so forth, that have called for a transitional justice mechanism to be implemented for migrant workers. Various recommendations have been made. I think all of you are fully aware of those recommendations and so on and so forth. One of those, the third appeal, in fact, called upon business to act responsibility in ensuring justice for migrant workers. So it is important to look at the role of business in preventing labor and human rights abuses, and for businesses to be guided by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. It also, this third appeal by civil society and other organizations highlighted what employers have to do to protect the rights of migrant workers throughout the world. And today we have with us one of the greatest advocates for migrant rights globally, and I think the foremost migrant rights advocate in the Asia Pacific region. It's none other than William Goyes, the the coordinator for Migrant Forum Asia. So it is my pleasure to call upon William to give us the opening remarks for this webinar. William, over to you.
No, thanks, Datu. Just to say very quickly, thank you very much again to the panel. And we do hope that in looking at today's topic, we will get a perspective in which stakeholders, particularly the private sector and the business sector, can see and what ideas we can put out there for them to share in this campaign, the responsibility that they have in the campaign and to realize this campaign. I think this is the most important part of this call. We are looking at different stakeholders. We are looking for accountability. We are looking for responsibility of stakeholders in this approach, particularly as the UN Secretary General has also said, we have to build back better. And to build back better, we have to look at all those gaps that have up until now been responsible for migrant workers not having access to justice. And this is one engagement with stakeholders to look at the possibility of joining ranks and seeing that together we can build back better. So thank you, and I hand over back to you, Daku.
Thank you, William, for the opening remarks. We have with us today a very eminent panel of speakers. And the first speaker who will give her thoughts on this issue of business and transitional justice is Isobel Archer. She's the project officer for migrant workers in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Isobel joined the Business and Human Rights Resource Center Middle East and North Africa team in 2019, where her work focuses on improving migrant worker welfare standards in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates construction and hotel sectors. Prior to joining the Resource Center, Isobel gained experience at Shiva Foundation, Environmental Resources Management, ERM, RDI International and ActionAid UK in improving corporate disclosure, labor rights, and tackling human trafficking in the hotel, construction, and professional services. Isobel holds a MA in Understanding and Securing Human Rights from the University of London. Over to you, Isobel.
Thanks, Dato, and thanks also Rula and William and everyone at Migrant Forum Asia today for inviting me to speak. It's great to be part of today's discussion and also marking this really important third development of the campaign. Thanks very much for the introduction as well, so I won't repeat that, but it's great to meet so many people virtually who I don't think I've yet spoken with. So I'd like to start by giving an overview of our own work on corporate accountability and our approach that we take, and give you an idea of some of the trends that we've seen generally over the duration of our work in this area, but also over the past few months, of course, during the COVID pandemic. So across the Resource Centre, all of our researchers, including myself, focus day to day on finding, researching, and highlighting cases where companies are facing public allegations of human rights and labour rights abuse wherever in the world and whatever form that takes. And when companies are named publicly, we do contact them directly and we invite them to respond to the allegations publicly as they've been put to the company, and we highlight those companies who respond to us or who don't respond to us on our website and through our communications. And we have a fairly good success rate with this approach, and it sort of hovers around the 70 to 75% rate globally. When we look specifically at our work in the Gulf, so across the 6 Gulf countries, not just Qatar and the UAE, that rate of getting companies to respond to us publicly drops to around 20 to 25% an average. And this is, as you've already mentioned and touched on, context is extremely important for all of our work. And I know my colleague will speak to our work in Asia after me, but this approach is extremely challenging in the Gulf for a number of different reasons. So firstly, as I'm sure most people know, the region as a whole is known to be particularly restrictive around human rights and labour rights, so unionising, or international NGOs might be banned, journalism curtailed. And so that pool of public information that we have around the situation for migrant workers and the ability for migrant workers to highlight their own situations is much more constricted than anywhere else in the world. Secondly, most often companies are not identified publicly by workers or by journalists who we depend on for their reporting, simply because of the very real possibility that migrant workers will face reprisals from companies for speaking out, but also from governments for voicing their criticism. And we've recorded a number of cases where workers were fired, arrested, detained for speaking with journalists, or even UN investigators. And then even when companies are named, accessing that transparency around the company structures and the business relationships that there are in the Gulf, particularly in the hotel and construction sectors, but broadly across the private sector, can be extremely difficult. And it's very challenging to try and unpick some of those chains of ownership of businesses that are local to the Gulf, and to really understand where responsibility for migrant workers lies when they face abuse. But the company for whom it appears they are working may not be the company who has directly employed those workers. And that's an argument which we face time and time again from companies who we approach. And you mentioned the UNGPs. Of course, the UNGPs mentioned that we're not just talking about subcontracted or directly employed workers, but any worker who comes within the scope of those businesses' operations or value chains. So all the factors that would ordinarily increase the likelihood of a company being responsive to us elsewhere in the world when faced with these public allegations is really, all of these factors are very absent from our work. And to try and gain some transparency on the types of abuses being reported to inform our other work, we have developed a methodology for analysing these cases of labour abuse. So since 2016, we've tracked just over 180 cases of abuse, impacting a recorded 59,000 migrant workers across the 6 Gulf countries, some of whom may be stranded in the Gulf at the time of reporting, but many of whom have already returned home and are yet to receive owed wages, compensation, benefits, end of service benefits, etc. And we believe this number really is just the tip of when you take into account that very restricted reporting environment. So the methodology assesses each case along 8 broad categories of labour abuse, and we look at a total of 20 indicators for labour exploitation, ranging from the issue of wage theft to issues around living, working conditions, injuries received at work, threats to workers, etc. And we also record where the abuse occurred, the details of the sector, the details of the company involved. And in terms of the most frequent abuses that we see, workers cite poor and precarious living conditions in just over 50%, so in 54% of cases that we record. And they cite issues with health and safety in the workplace in 34% of cases. The second most frequent form of abuse are infringements on workers' fundamental freedoms, so restrictions on workers' freedom of movement, whether because visas haven't been renewed or workers have been imprisoned for speaking out about their situations, and that restriction on freedom of expression as well. And that's cited in about 2/3 of all cases that we record. And then I think it will come as no surprise to anyone on today's call that the most frequent types of abuse cited by migrant workers centre on their conditions of employment. So this is anything to do with wages, their contracts, their lack of contracts, whether they've paid recruitment fees, etc. And this occurs in 87% of all cases that we record. On the issue of wage theft, this is by far our most commonly recorded indicator. And we find that withheld wages, delayed wages, partial payment of wages, in whatever form that comes, are cited in 4 out of 5 cases. So in 80% of cases, that's an issue. And this analysis is particularly helpful to give us an insight into the extent of these forms of labour abuse, because I think they're widely reported and known about, but this really gives us some data to understand who is being impacted and where. But particularly within the context of the last few months, this has been extremely helpful to really understand the severity that the pandemic is having on what are already dire conditions that workers are found in. So I'm going to detail some statistics now. I am more than happy to share these afterwards because I know that sometimes it's difficult to keep them in mind, but I do think it's important to just show the scale of this crisis. So firstly, between April of this year and about mid last month, so mid July, we had a monumental increase in the number of allegations that we were recording when compared with the same period last year. And this was an increase of just under 400%, so almost 4 times that previous total. And by this time, we had also well surpassed the total number of cases recorded throughout the whole of 2019. And we found that COVID-19 was cited in 77% of those cases recorded, whether as regards lack of access to medical care, workers being stranded, and of course, workers not being paid, with employers citing economic downturn. And that was, COVID-19 was cited as a key causal or exacerbatory factor in that majority of cases. On the problem of wage theft specifically, and workers citing this irregular or non-payment of wages, the proportion of cases in which this was cited has remained fairly steady, again at roughly sort of 4 out of 5 cases will cite wage theft as an issue. But again, what we noted was this huge increase in the number of cases of wage theft being reported compared with this time last year. And again, this is a similar increase of about just under 400%. But what's also become very evident from our reporting and this analysis are the knock-on effects of wage theft as related to issues around living conditions for workers, access to food, access to accommodation, and also working conditions. So whether there are infringements of health and safety standards, or workers don't feel safe working during the pandemic. So in terms of workers citing poor or precarious accommodation, we had this occur over 5 times as many compared with the same period last year, which was an increase of 530%. And similarly, we also saw an uptick in the number of times that workers report health and safety issues, and that was an increase of about 400, just over 400%. I'm conscious of time. I don't think I'm running out of time quite yet, but I do just want to wrap up my first intervention by coming back to that direct engagement with companies, and particularly on the wage theft issue and during the pandemic. And I think it will come as no surprise again that this is one of the most common types of abuse that we approach companies on. And during the pandemic, we've hugely increased the rate at which we've been able to approach publicly named companies, because reports have increased so much as this issue has become more widespread. We've actually had a slightly higher response rate during the pandemic than usual, so of about 30% rather than 20%, for example, which I think can largely be attributed to the fact that companies are aware of increased scrutiny from groups like yourselves, from our organization, from the media. But I think another thing is that we've probably approached more multinational or very high profile, high worth companies recently, particularly in light of the cases of mass layoffs and mass wage theft. And then a third aspect, which I think has been particularly effective, especially when we think about those challenges regarding business relationships and really drilling down into who legally may have responsibility for workers and working conditions and workers' wages, has to be an emphasis on how useful it's been to approach companies when they are not actually the direct employers. So we've also contacted clients of construction companies, particularly because these are often high profile projects, and that kind of added scrutiny is absolutely not what they want. We've also approached, for example, multinational hotels and venue brands on workers employed at those locations. And I most recently had a hotel company reply to me today to state that because of our outreach to them, they had started an investigation into allegations of human rights abuse and were liaising with their local team. They weren't aware of this previously. And then another example, again from today actually, was that we received a response from a company who had previously not engaged when an NGO had approached them. But because we conducted outreach to their extremely large international holding company, the holding company put pressure on the company that was within their portfolio, and they did consequently then disclose more information on the case, address the details, and this will hopefully be featured in full for everyone to see next week, or perhaps the week after. And I think that this really shows how perhaps thinking a little bit more laterally and being a little bit creative with that kind of engagement when bringing pressure to bear around a business relationship. I'm really emphasizing the risk of being associated with a company that's facing these kinds of allegations can be very worthwhile. It may be challenging, and it does require a lot of back and forth with companies directly, but I think this can really have quite some leverage in our context where this is otherwise very challenging. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not sure how much time I had left, but I'm very happy to speak more on anything I've touched on now later in the conversation. But otherwise, I think I will hand back to you, Dato.
Thank you, Isabel, for giving us that comprehensive overview of the situation in the Middle East, especially the challenging human rights and labor rights situation. Also for telling us on the various indicators for labor exploitation. And you've highlighted to us that the major issue, the elephant in the room really, the whole issue of wage theft and the exploitative conditions in which migrant workers live in the Middle East. But there is some hope, as you have said, about the your engagement with companies, with businesses to resolve these issues. And there is, of course, movement and progress on that. Thank you, Isabel. The next speaker is Golda S. Benjamin. She is the program director with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Golda joined the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in March 2017 as the Southeast Asia researcher and representative. Golda also teaches law and runs a solo practice law firm focusing on development policy reform and commercial arbitration. Prior to her time at the Resource Center, she served as one of the civil society representatives in the Philippines Multi-Sectoral Group for Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. She also served as chief for legislation of a senator of the Republic of the Philippines and supervised the development of various laws. So she would be able to tell us what are the laws that needs to be reformed, the reforms that is required. Golda's alternative law practice began at Ideals Incorporated Philippines, where she focused on agrarian reform, tax justice, environment and trade issues, handling litigation, advocacy, and policy reform. Golda has a Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of the Philippines. For those of you from abroad, the UP or the University of Philippines has got the premier law school in the whole of Philippines. She also has a master's degree with specialization in international commercial arbitration. Golda, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone from the Philippines. What an incredible webinar with almost 200 participants and counting. So I was asked to give a brief overview on the conditions in Asia, specifically in the garment sector. So I'm going to relate some of the stories and some of what we are doing, hoping that in giving rise or amplifying all these trends and allegations that we're seeing in the sector, that we also can find ways of working together to elevate campaigns and find ways to extract more accountability from businesses. So ever since the conditions on the impact of COVID-19 became more and more serious, we started tracking the responses of businesses and corporations around the world. And specifically for the garment sector, we looked at the 33 biggest multinational garment companies, and we now have a developing and growing COVID-19 apparel action tracker. And the purpose of this initiative really is to look at how brands are responding to the crisis and how these responses are affecting the workers down the line. So some of the worrying trends that we're seeing is that a lot of companies, of course, have refused to pay their workers or have requested, for example, for discounts in their pending orders, which in turn affect the ability of their suppliers to also pay their workers in the host countries. There are also some positive trends wherein apparel companies have extended payment times for their suppliers and have also supported their suppliers in terms of accessing financial subsidies so that they can continue operating and they don't have to dismiss a lot of their workers on the ground. We also see a lot of the trend that despite the economic difficulty and the pressure and the suffering of workers around the region, that many companies still continue to pay shareholder dividends. And this is something that we should all be looking at because this is really a time for shared pain according to many who have articulated the responsibility of businesses. For the more responsible businesses, many of them have paid both their existing orders and their contracted orders, even if production has not started, and that's a positive development. Some companies have also chosen to set up mechanisms for grievances, which is positive because the feedback is immediate and there's a way for these multinational companies to liaise with their suppliers and then also with their workers. And also, more responsible businesses have come forward to actually support calls directed to governments in terms of providing safety and better working conditions, safe repatriation, ensuring wage payments of especially the migrant workers. But the trends continue to be worrying. We have also started. So we are tracking the responses of businesses of the garment companies in Asia. And we are also starting to look at specific countries. What are the calls of certain country organizations, whether these are labor organizations, migrants organizations, what calls have been raised already and how are governments and businesses responding to these calls. And from this latest tracking and survey that we had, we realized and we discovered that in 7 of the 10 countries that we're currently looking at very closely, there is really a lack of COVID-19 safety precautions in garments factories. So we see that all over Asia. And another disturbing trend is that in 4 of the 10 countries in our country trackers, garment worker protests over unpaid wages have been met with violent crackdowns. So we have seen and have responded to reports from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Myanmar, and from the Philippines. Of course, very important is for businesses right now to really respect the exercise of the freedoms of association and assembly, but we're not seeing very positive trends on that area. We're looking at, we recently released a union busting brief looking at the behavior and the responses of 9 apparel companies. And despite the fact that we only looked at 9, we found out that almost 5,000 union workers have been sacked. And there is evidence to point that their dismissals were also partly due to the fact that they are union members. And despite many pressures from different organizations, there are still 6 major unresolved cases involving very big factories with thousands of workers. Now, it's important also to look at how companies are responding and compare this also with their publicly disclosed policies. This is an entry point, especially like for us for the Resource Center, when we write the companies to respond to allegations of abuse, we do point out on many occasions their publicly disclosed policies on, for example, workers' rights, grievance mechanisms, and the like. But unfortunately, many companies have chosen any of these responses. Number one, many of them still choose not to engage or not to respond to allegations of abuse, despite repeated outreach from us and other organizations. Other companies also operate with very limited transparency and accountability. Just simply giving us broad strokes answers like they're looking into it, but never really giving us feedback as to the result of their investigations. Of course, obviously, there is a big gap in many of the company brand policy commitments versus factory implementation. And we have done a lot of work on this because we work closely with unions in various countries in Asia. So every time we get a response about from brands saying that, oh, they have this policy in favor of protection of human rights, or they are protecting, as a policy, they are protecting workers right now. It's easier now for us to get feedback and reach out to the unions and the workers' organizations all across Asia to really check if factory implementation is consistent with brand policies. And we have recently strengthened also another mechanism to our company response mechanism explained by Izzy a while ago, and that is the process of rejoinders, meaning as soon as we get a response from the brand or the garment company, we also ask and invite the unions and the workers associations to send the rejoiners, just so that there will be like a cross-checking of the claims of the brands, pushing corporate accountability more and more, especially in this difficult time. Of course, there's also the usual defense of the company when they defer to local labor laws that fall short of international standards. We see this a lot on the wage theft issue, on the minimum wage issue, and even on freedom of association issues. Many companies always phrase their responses and say that they are respectful of country legislation or the legislation that bind their factories, and thus they can only do so much. Of course, we know that this is not enough, that we have to continuously push the multinational companies to go beyond often labor laws that are really way below international standards. Of course, there's also the non-transparent dialogue with suppliers. We don't know what comes out of these dialogues, so it's important that we continue the push and outreach also to the companies, getting a lot of verifiable information from the workers themselves all across Asia or wherever you are operating in your own respective jurisdictions or your work. And finally, this we really need, and we continue to track the commitment of companies to really resolve the issues on the ground, even if it's wage theft or it is a violation of freedom of associations of the workers. There are still a lot of unresolved cases, and that's why campaigns have to be strengthened, and we need to continue supporting each other. From the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we can help by doing company outreach and generating as much evidence. We continue to track the responses of governments and companies, and with a hope also that this will be useful to campaign organizations and movements around the world, so that our outreach also to companies and our push for government legislation reform will be evidence-based. So for my first intervention, I'd like to limit those to my discussion of the trends and what have been the responses of the companies, and would be happy to also get back and discuss more on some of the calls that we have gathered from various organizations around the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Golda, for your perspective on the garment sector, as well as the rising trends in Asia regarding the challenges faced by workers generally and migrant workers. You've also thank you also for giving us the responses that you've got from governments as well as from the businesses, and for highlighting the gaps that exist in the securing of migrant workers' rights, the issues that arise from wage theft, the issues that arise from the denial of the freedom of association, and so on. These are very serious issues, and we will continue the discussion later. The next speaker that we have is Miss Mary Apostle. Mary is the founder and president, as well as the chief executive officer of the Fair Hiring Initiative. The initiative is a social enterprise that develops, tests, and promotes ethical recruitment, models, and addresses issues of forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking in labor migration. In 2004, Mary founded Verite Southeast Asia and served as its executive director until 2012, where she led the development of Verite Systems approach for social responsibility, the Verite Fair Hiring Toolkit, and prepared the original draft for the Manpower Verite Ethical Framework for cross-border recruitment. She has trained and consulted for companies such as Starbucks, Apple, The Home Depot, Walmart, Gap, Levi Strauss, Hewlett-Packard, New Balance, Hershey's, and Motorola. And this is not an advertisement call, yeah, for the companies. In the improvement of internal and supply chain level program systems and organizational competencies for managing corporate social responsibility. Prior to her work with Verite, Mary served as an independent consultant on poverty alleviation and social reform and worked on projects for the Philippine government, bilateral agencies, international NGOs, and a number of UN agencies. Mary, over to you. Mary, are you there?
I'm here. Hi,
Yeah.
Dato.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right.
And thank you, MFA, for this opportunity to speak. I got the invitation about 24 hours ago, but as usual, I can't say no to William. So I will apologize in advance that I'm not as prepared as I normally would be, but I'll do my best to address the questions that were requested. Now, let me just give you some background on what we do. The Fair Hiring Initiative is focused primarily on ethical recruitment models and ensuring that workers, migrant workers, are recruited in a fair, legal, and humane manner. We've been working on labor certification models that improve the performance of recruitment agencies in both sending and receiving countries to prevent issues of trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and a lot of the employment issues or employment contract violations that have been talked about by the speakers before me. I would also like to mention, because I think it's more pertinent to the discussion right now, that I'm the founder of Verite Southeast Asia, which works on corporate social responsibility in supply chains. And I resumed my position as executive director in January. So I think it's more pertinent possibly to speak about the activities of Verite Southeast Asia in this forum, as it speaks more directly to the appeal that the consortium is putting forward. What we're seeing, so Verite works on, as I said, supply chain social responsibility. It uses, it leverages the power of the buyer to make the buyer or the brand to make positive improvements in the workforces of its supply chain. So what Verite does basically is it conducts one of the pivotal or central functions of Verite over the last 20 years has really been creating some transparency to the work to Southeast Asian, South Asian, and African workplaces where Western products are being manufactured. And what we try to do is we assess companies against the standards that are set by either a company or an industry group, and through that identify where the gaps in performance are in terms of meeting voluntary standards. As Golda mentioned, these standards should and have tended to be higher than country laws, because mainly for an international brand, they have to meet the laws in every country, not just one. So they set the standards at a much higher, typically at a level where anywhere in the world they would be meeting at the bare minimum country law. And a lot of these standards are meant to prevent issues like wage theft, issues like debt bondage, child labor, and other issues, particularly forced labor related to migrant workers. What we're seeing in a lot, and I must premise this also with the fact that Verite has been working with Fortune 500 brands and who tend to adhere to international standards. And what I'm talking about here is more about the issues in formal employment rather than informal employment. What we're seeing is really an exacerbation by COVID of the already harmful and risky practices that we've been seeing previously. In a recent, we were recently approached by a client, and maybe I can just talk about that. We were recently approached by a client to look into the issues of stranded, to look into the conditions of stranded and returned Indonesian and Nepali workers, to make sure they were looking at it, to make sure that they were meeting their own code of conduct standards, but also they were responding to an inquiry by a non-government organization that came from complaints made by workers. So it was the brand or the company that owned the factory that was approached by an NGO speaking on behalf of workers who were complaining about subsistence allowances provided by the company and other issues. What was interesting about this is that this led to the company requesting Verite to interview these workers and understand exactly what the situation was. Now, they owned the company, they had staff within that company, but they wanted to have a third-party review to make sure that, because they said they are in uncharted waters and the issues of COVID have not been really integrated into their code of conduct, and they would like to understand better what they could improve. So what we saw were really the issues that we were finding were some of the workers had typically the repatriation period is about 2 weeks, during which time 2 weeks to 3 weeks, during which time workers are repatriated to their home countries after the end of their contract. In this case, because of COVID, workers had to stay for the repatriation was delayed because of lack of flights, among other things, and the delays in getting the proper documentation out of the destination country authorities. And workers were stranded for as long as, some workers were stranded for as long as 100 days. And typically, the company doesn't normally have to pay for meals and continuing accommodations for workers for such a long period. So this is something that they had to add on to their what they provided to workers. So supplemental subsistence allowances during the period that they were there. Apparently, they were the government, the sending country government embassy, also provided some help. They had to provide increased communication facilities and increase in communication channels, I'm sorry, because of the constant need to communicate with the workers. What we found was that they really needed to change to reinforce their standards with the COVID situation in mind, because for example, the cost increases, the time spent by staff, the workers, the issues of workers related to, you know, mental health concerns, not being able to leave their dormitories, not having enough money for all of their needs during that period. And I think some of the other issues had to do more with delays in answers to their questions on when they could depart, etc. So those, I think, in this situation, it was really just reviewing what a company needed to address more clearly and integrate into their code of conduct or into their standards and in their procedures, to make sure that they were meeting the needs of the workers even after they had ended their contracts. So in this case, it was fortunate that there were no wage theft issues, but there were delays in payment of last wages, and the last wages of workers were actually had to be spent on their own subsistence during the 100 days that they were stranded. So those are just some of the issues that we saw in this situation. Some of the things that Verite has been doing to address, to assist, and that might help to promote the appeal is we try and strengthen the codes of conduct of companies, help them review their codes of conduct, and identify where COVID-19 impacts could weaken their procedures. For example, speeding up repatriation, making sure that workers are paid their last wages before they leave, ensuring free food and accommodations, medical care and insurance, just the provision of some confidence that if a worker gets sick of COVID, they have someone to turn to, they know where to go, the company will cover those costs. We've also advised companies to identify hotspots and anticipate issues, particularly in sectors where there are, for example, production booms. That could increase hours, force workers to to work hours that they might not be paid for, and mainly, involuntary overtime, etc. We also encourage companies to set up, if they don't have them already, effective monitoring and grievance mechanisms. In the example that I gave of the facility, they had 5 grievance channels for workers, well established, but still the workers felt that the responses were delayed. They felt that the responses were delayed, were inconsistent, and were not satisfactory, and it increased the workers' discomfort and a feeling of uncertainty. So clarity, consistency, and promptness in responding to workers' grievances and questions during the COVID period. How to promote the appeal. And I think some of the two speakers who spoke before me already started talking about some of these things. I think one is really to engage and secure commitments from industry groups that are already supporting responsible recruitment and migrant worker rights to adopt the appeal or to help push the appeal, or to integrate the components of the appeal into their existing voluntary codes. We can also make sure that investors, when I speak of industry groups, I mean those groups that already have strong standards that support migrant workers, such as the Responsible Business Alliance, the Seafood Task Force in Thailand, the leadership group that I'm sure Neil will be talking about in a little while. I think companies also listen to investors, and shareholder resolutions, or engaging with investor groups that fund, the construction companies that Isabel talked about, and making sure that the components of the appeal are included in the way the investors screen their investments, and the companies that they will invest in might be helpful. I think it's important to influence and leverage the public commitments that companies have made in support of migrant workers and their rights. And then, of course, a lot of companies, worker voice, worker feedback, grievance mechanisms, these are very popular now among corporates. Everybody is setting up a grievance mechanism. I think civil society needs to test those grievance mechanisms more. Test them and see how effective, how responsive these grievance mechanisms are for issues that we are looking at in terms of wage theft. I understand that Isabel and Golda have used them and have engaged directly with the companies that and have gotten some responses. I think we are going to be looking at what we've also been talking to a lot of recruitment agencies, and we know that recruitment in a lot of sending countries has stopped. And what's happening now is really people just coming home in masses. But what recruitment agencies have told us is that we are looking at an increase in recruitment costs of about 40%. Now, we were talking to an agency that earns its revenues only from employers and does not charge anything to workers. And they're saying the cost to an employer per worker will increase by 40%. What this means to us who are working on recruitment reform and migrant worker rights is that we only have maybe 2% of the whole industry, maybe less than 2% of the whole recruitment industry actually following an employer pays model. So when we talk about a 40% increase in recruitment costs, and that will be due to quarantine requirements, higher airfare costs, longer time while workers wait to go out, higher documentation costs, as well as even things like PPE. That's what would cause this increase. We're actually looking at for maybe more than a 40% increase in what workers are likely to bear. The fact that there's increasing unemployment, returned migrants will be competing with local workers for jobs, as well as with other migrants for jobs abroad, and all of the restrictions on travel. These will all cause increased desperation and workers wanting to leave and find jobs at any cost. Their vulnerability to exploitation increases 100-fold. And the cost that they are going to bear, which will also increase their vulnerability later to wage theft, to forced labor, to other forms of exploitation, will increase accordingly. So I think that's what we're looking at. And I think for us, it's really how do we prevent, what are the preventive mechanisms? How do we strengthen that? And then what are the controls for mitigation, such as the transitional justice that we're promoting through this MFA initiative. I'll end with that, and I hope I haven't gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for enlightening us on the power of the buyer to make positive changes. I would also like to thank you for your insights on how engagement with business leads to positive change, that it is imperative that we engage. And what is gratifying to note at this session is that you have also informed us that you will be incorporating the third appeal on how businesses should act responsibly in ensuring justice for migrant workers. So this is something that I hope that the various businesses will take on. We will come back to you in the question and answer session after this. The next speaker we have today is Mr. Murtaza Khan. Murtaza is the regional managing partner at Fragomen for Middle East and Africa region. Fragomen is is the global leader in immigration services and solutions. Murtaza has been based in the Middle East for the past 14 years and is responsible for fragments, practices, and network partners spanning across the Middle East and Africa region. In this capacity, he has extensive experience of working with large global and regional companies alongside the small and medium enterprise sector. He has deep knowledge of regional business, immigration, mobility, and deployment issues. Murtaza is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and he has worked in the corporate and audit finance advisory divisions at the in one of the big four. Being an expert in business migration across the region, he has spoken at numerous global and regional events. He has also published several articles expressing thought leadership on the subject of migration. As a representative of the GFMD business mechanism, he has advised and provided input at the intergovernmental process facilitated by the United Nations in adopting the Global Compact on Migration in 2018. He continues to represent the private sector at the Global Forum on Migration and Development and has consistently been providing input at various regional consultative processes, including the Abu Dhabi Dialogue and the African Union. Over to you, Murtaza.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dado. I'd like to just start by appreciating and thanking the preceding speakers for some highly insightful comments and some of the data shared by Isabel and the approaches, the innovative approaches of the organization. And some excellent comments by both Golda and Marie in relation to partnering with the private sector and business. And before I really go into some of the COVID specific situation and measures and policies adopted, I just want to take a little step back because it's important that we do continue on the basis of partnering closely as business. I do sit on the GFMD business mechanism and represent a number of interests around businesses with regards to migration issues around the world, and specifically in the Middle East and Africa region, which is my core focus. And of course, having been based here for quite some time, I can relate to a lot of the issues. So just to take that quick segue into what we've framed at the business mechanism as the position on migration vis-a-vis responsible recruitment and fair and ethical practices, which are really core which form a core pillar of the asks of the business mechanism at government level or at reform level when it comes to international mobility issues. So there's a clear recognition that companies need to attract skills and talent that might not be available in the local markets from overseas. And at the same time, this international labor mobility affords opportunities to foreign workers that they may not come across in their home countries. And the first point of entry really is the recruitment process. We've always held that special attention does need to be given in that part of the process, where companies that are recruiting abroad, the recruitment agencies that they're using, that they support their clients to find the right talent, that they should ensure transparency in labor supply chain and ensure that all recruitment activities are performed in accordance with ethical principles and local best practice regulation that sits beyond local legislation as well. And many mechanisms have been discussed, and I was very interested to hear about the Verite system that Marie spoke about as well in that regard. So the risks when it comes to human and labor rights violations, which obviously have implications for the protection and welfare of recruited workers, as well as they have an implication for the reputation of companies and employment agencies that are involved. So it's really fundamentally important to differentiate between the various ethical and compliant players from the rogue recruitment agencies and employers that make a profit at the expense of the fundamental rights of workers. And I think that has already been borne out from the discussion that there are points made by Isabel in relation to some of the lateral thinking and approaching parent companies or franchise owners in the hotel industry has actually yielded results and actual investigations, which truly showcases that there are companies that are willing to go above and beyond local legislation and implement strong standards. So compliance with the law is a primary duty of all enterprises. This is a clear position that is held by the private sector constituency that we represent. And non-compliance risks to companies themselves often result in huge administrative and legal costs, as well as reputational damage that can destroy a brand. So avoiding this damage is quite essential to companies where in the world we live in, news spreads in a matter of seconds. And companies have a recognition that reputation is really hard to build, but probably can be destroyed in less than 5 minutes. So that's where part of the responsibility for ethical, fair, and compliant recruitment also actually brings in real incentives and advantages to companies themselves, and in a way considered good practice for business itself. And clients and business partners are increasingly demanding from their supply chains to adhere to higher standards, to higher standards than local legislation. So if we see procurement processes where certain standards around labor rights or migrant rights are actually a part of a particular procurement process in companies that are bidding for a project, and those are again some good best practices that we have been promoting and discussing at the business mechanism level. So in addition to other standards, like standards and principles developed by the World Employment Confederation in their code of conduct, or there are many initiatives, some of them led by the organizations that are on the panel today as well, that promote fair and ethical recruitment. And notwithstanding all of these, business has always the responsibility and duty to respect workers' rights. Throughout the recruitment process, companies, having said this, companies alone cannot solve the problem of unscrupulous recruitment practices. And they need governments to adopt and enforce the right legal and regulatory framework. For example, too many countries lack effective frameworks to really set the ground rules on who can operate as a recruitment agency and under what conditions they can set up or continue to operate, and what kind of monitoring goes into that process as well on an ongoing basis. And the landscape becomes even more complex when the recruitment process involves multiple countries with sub-agencies and subcontractors at a local, regional or subsector within a country as well. So for this reason, actions that governments take are essential to certainly address the legal gaps or practices that have become embedded in certain local cultures. At the same time, sometimes local or national regulation is there, but implementation is often too ineffective or counterproductive. And this can then result in increasingly burdensome requirements placed on recruitment companies, while at the same time not really focusing on the core issues and non-compliant actors who may find loopholes. So in sum, by committing to ethical recruitment principles, participating in multi-stakeholder initiatives, and really advocating for appropriate national legislation and regulations, companies can demonstrate their commitment and adherence with legislation governing recruitment of foreign workers. So, with that background and position statement, I wanted to just move to the current context of the impact of COVID-19 on businesses and economies. More specifically in the Middle East region, I can speak at. And we've seen data from the World Bank in this regard, and the data keeps coming, and each time there's a downward revision, unfortunately. Things like global GDP impacts being global GDP contracting by over 5%, and in the Middle East by over 4% over the course of the year. Governments have taken necessary measures to control the pandemic, which started with travel and border closures and went as far as total countrywide lockdowns and curfews. Restrictions on travel and tourism have caused this severe devastation in the aviation, travel, tourism, and hospitality industries. The resultant fall we've seen in energy and commodity prices, which has impacted the oil and gas industry significantly. And that alone in the oil and gas industry, which is such a cornerstone industry in this region, will likely result in a reduction in capital expenditure on new projects, which was originally planned by around 20% as the minimum level. The ILO has pointed out there's been an overall drop in the number of working hours across the Arab states of over 13%. That's the equivalent of their estimate of essentially job losses in another measure, if you like. And employers have obviously had to respond to the pandemic, and they have done so in many different ways. So the companies that were able to immediately move to a working from home structure or remote working arrangements have immediately done so through the modern tools that are available to us and in terms of digital connectivity. Many companies, for instance, in the technology sector, who've been very successful with maintaining business continuity, partially due to existing remote working policies, but also due to the way their business models are set up. They've gone on to maintain their staffing levels without any impact on salaries or benefits for their employees. On the other hand, sectors that have been harder hit have had to institute policies ranging from hiring freezes to furloughs or reduction in working hours, reduction in pay and layoffs in certain industries as well. And there are also industries that are facing longer term structural implications or change or disruption to the way they operate. And of course, that will have longer term ramifications and vis-a-vis their own business models. So those are being looked at as well. Now, so there was a discussion on how transitional justice is important, and certainly certain countries have put into place COVID-related legislation, such as the UAE, in terms of a resolution that has allowed for companies to take certain measures as a result of the impact on business, and whether those measures include, mandating annual leave, paid or unpaid, reduction in salaries, or ultimately for companies faced by significant losses to make provisions for layoffs, although they have communicated within the context and framework of the resolution some very specific benefits as well, and requirement for compliance with ensuring that existing laws and policies around gratuity or end of service benefits are fully adhered to. Things like health insurance are continually provided until the workers remain in the country. Accommodation arrangements to be continually provided until they remain in the country as well. Of course, flight restrictions and travel restrictions haven't allowed for people to be repatriated on a timely basis. And that's, a bilateral issue that the countries have been looking at on almost a case-to-case basis. But some very interesting measures that also have come out with the UAE and Bahrain, who've instituted somewhat of a virtual labor market. So for companies who were unable to pay their workers, for them to place them on the on the respective ministries' database for them almost to have a first right of recruitment or almost review at a level where employers are looking to staff. Now, on an immediate basis, you may think that may not be very helpful in a market where hiring or recruitment is not happening, or where if a worker is in a certain industry, there's an industry-wide impact, so there's unlikely to be a job available. But where it's interesting is Bahrain, for instance, has made it as part of the availability for local Bahraini workers as well as foreign workers to go on the LMRA's database, to mandate employers to screen through that database at first before they would be able to bring another worker in from a foreign jurisdiction. So some really, I would say, good or innovative attempts at trying to create opportunities for the migrant workers that are already there in a particular country. What's also been borne out is the lack of a safety net or social security mechanisms in the event of such an economic crisis. I think in many countries around Europe and in North America, the governments have also stepped in to subsidize wages of workers. That has not been the case in our region, and things like I think it was also referenced, payment of gratuities has become an issue, where gratuity is legislatively in this region accounted for within the books of a company, as opposed to being put away in an external third-party pension fund, for instance. Although having said that, in the UAE, the DIFC initiated at the beginning of the year a contribution scheme in lieu of the end of service gratuity. So from January or February, I believe, onwards, all of the companies operating within the jurisdiction of the Dubai's financial center have had to actually pay the gratuity into a third-party managed pension fund, if you like, which is then directly accessible to the workers. So it's the start of something or a new practice that has been put into place, but one that certainly, as a result of the pandemic, could be a big learning factor to take into account in other countries and other jurisdictions, and thereby protecting the gratuities of both local and foreign workers in that context. The other thing that was interesting, and this is something the UAE implemented last year, was a replacement of just to give context, in the past, for every foreign workers, companies had to put down a fixed deposit with the Ministry of Labor. And they replaced that fixed deposit with an insurance scheme for which you'd pay a nominal amount. But on the back end of the insurance policy, that can cover costs of up to 20,000 dirhams, which relates to returning repatriation costs or unpaid wages or end of service gratuities in the event that contributes towards that. That could be a policy that could now be utilized. There is an issue potentially in terms of awareness levels and the ability to actually access and draw on those. But these are some interesting and innovative things that I wanted to put forth to contribute to the dialogue and discussion, and particularly when we talk about what are the suggestions or best practices that could be brought forth. Marie also referenced that many Fortune 500 brands take a responsible approach to their employment policies far beyond local legislation, which certainly resonates within our constituency as well. And there is a leverage to also look at how those employers are in a way rewarded through the legislation process, but also from a best practice sharing perspective. Some of the lesser experienced businesses or in the small and medium sized sector, they could benefit from such sharing of best practices. Grievance mechanisms were raised earlier, and the issue of I think Isabel raised the issue of fear of reprisals for whistleblowers, and certainly a lot of companies follow very comprehensive policies around how they ensure the protection of whistleblowers or internal reporting mechanisms that allow for non-disclosure to be in place in the event of complaints and grievances being raised at an internal organizational level, and to try and seek to make those part and parcel of things like sponsorship obligations that attach to companies around the world. And one other interesting point I wanted to raise from what Marie mentioned is that investor groups are often a great source of leverage, and Isabel also talked about approaching investor groups, and I fully agree with that in the sense of global investors in terms of big equity firms or powerhouses in the pensions businesses. These are highly regulated businesses, and part of the obligations that they're starting to look at are to what extent the investments they're making also follow responsible guidelines, whether it relates to the SDGs or specific areas of the SDGs, which include fair and ethical recruitment practices, allowing for equal opportunities, employment opportunities, non-discrimination, etc. So these are a great source of leverage as well. If you look at it in terms of scaling that concept and adoption of the highest principles. So I just wanted to, I know I'm going on for a bit, but I just want to open up.
Yes. Could you wrap up, please? Mr. Murtaza?
Yeah, thank you. Over back to you. I'm finished.
Thank you, Mr. Murtaza, for enlightening us on the various issues and also responding to the various other speakers on the matters raised. And also to highlight the issue of national legislation, especially the COVID legislation that has been legislated in many jurisdictions. We are actually running out of time a bit. Sorry to cut you short just now, because we have 2 more speakers to go. The next presentation will be by Neil Wilkins. He's the head of Migrant Worker Program, Institute for Human Rights and Business. Neil Wilkins is responsible for all aspects of the Institute for Human Rights and Business Migrant Workers Program, and in 2011 helped oversee the development of the Dhaka Principles for Migration with Dignity, a set of human rights-based principles that offer a clear framework for understanding the recruitment and employment of migrant workers worldwide. More recently, Neil has led much of the Institute for Human Rights and Business work around responsible recruitment and the promotion of recruitment models based on the employer pays principle, which prohibits the charging of recruitment fees and costs for workers. Neil also manages the IHRB engagement with the modern slavery agenda and speaks regularly at events focused on forced labor, trafficking, and transparency legislation. He has worked extensively with the construction, apparel, and hospitality sectors, along with participation at intergovernmental events such as the Colombo Process and the Global Forum for Migration and Development. Neil?
Thank you, Datta. And I must remember to send in a much shorter CV next time I'm asked. And if it's okay, I will not turn my video on, as I've been having broadband issues today, and it drains my capacity for broadband. I think that reflecting on some of the previous comments and some of the views of previous speakers, I think we need to really consider that much of this, the problems that we see today are caused by attitudes toward migrant workers, discrimination, prejudice, and a sort of negative view of migrants. And this in some ways allows poor practice to fester, and in some ways as well, criminality is allowed to flourish. If effective supervision of recruitment and employment agencies is lacking, if contracts can be substituted, amended, or ignored at will, why then are we surprised when things like wage theft happen? And we need much more effective supervision of the recruitment and employment agencies being undertaken by government, because there's a limit to where well-meaning initiatives by business can actually take us. And for any people on the call who aren't familiar with the new Montreal recommendations around effective regulation of the recruitment industry, the IOM this year, based on a consultation that took place in Montreal last year, released these Montreal recommendations, which are a roadmap to better regulation. And I think that we all need to be trying to promote that as much as possible. They sit very neatly with the previous ILO's general principles for fair and ethical recruitment. So I would advise colleagues to please have a look at those. Now, I work closely with international brands, and of course, in response to COVID, very often many of the international brands are far more comfortable at the end of the supply chain that's closer to their direct operations. So many of them were able to instigate quite quickly measures within, for instance, their supermarkets and their retail stores to keep their staff and the general public safe in order that they might be able to keep trading. It becomes much harder at supplier level. We've seen good practice and we've seen poor practice, of course. Good practice would be for companies to honour their contracts with suppliers, of course, ensure prompt payment, and also to perhaps make sure that their attitude towards deadline and deliveries have been flexible. I think that one of the things that business can generally do well is around communications. And so there's a role for business to play here, helping their suppliers gain access to information and how to then offer up and present that information to their migrant workforces. Companies perhaps have better access to the briefings that were being given out by the IOM and ILO and can potentially play a good role in disseminating that information down through their supply chains. They also have some access, though perhaps not as much as is generally thought, to government, but their trade associations do. And I think there's a big role for business to be active within their trade associations to ensure best practice and to help their suppliers implement practical measures. You know, how can you ensure that your workforces are kept safe? And how can the brands use their leverage with their suppliers to ensure that the correct procedures are being put in place there? The difficulties, of course, for the brands in this situation is they're very keen to keep things moving, keep supplies coming into their operations, of course, and they have their own capacity might be limited. Many international brands have laid off their own head office staff, so there's limited capacity there perhaps as well. I would as well like to just talk about a particular group of workers who tend to get forgotten in these discussions. And I think the one thing that coronavirus pandemic has taught us is what is our view of essential workers and frontline workers. And I think one particular group of hidden workers, very often hidden from view, are the transport and logistics staff. And we increasingly are realizing how we suddenly became aware how dependent we are on those hidden workers. And 90% of all goods are transported by sea. And seafarers don't have the best of times in normal situations. They live in cramped spaces, very often poor working and living conditions, and of course now things are far worse. And there's currently 150,000 seafarers with expired contracts trapped at sea because crew changing in many jurisdictions has been prevented either by governments or by companies themselves. If staff are allowed on shore, very often they find that their wages have been withheld, which means they've then got nothing to spend ashore and no money to remit home to families. So families back home are without money. So that's seafarers. Then, of course, there's dock workers. You know, many dock workers are the poorest of the poor migrant workers. Many of them will be in situations of debt bondage through the payment of recruitment fees. It's generally considered that many of them will be in poor working and living conditions. There's a lack of personal protective equipment, and many of them will be very responsible, very dependent on their employers for information, for their visas and for their migration status. For truck drivers, we see similar lacks of personal protective equipment. We've seen many roadside facilities closed down as a security measure. But of course, this means it's very hard for truck drivers to access toilets and sanitation facilities, but also, food stops and things like that as well. They're also facing long waits or increased waits at factories, warehouses, and of course at international borders, while goods and themselves very often get checked. Other areas of logistics, of course, have seen a surge. We've seen an increase, of course, in online shopping, which has meant increased demand in warehousing, and companies like Amazon have announced over 100,000 new staff to be employed in their warehouse operations. But we must wonder how it's possible to accommodate these increases and still keep those warehouse staff, many of whom will be agency, contract and migrant workers. How can we keep those safe? And that perhaps at a company like Amazon, you know, where there's a lot of reputational leverage to worry about, things might, measures might be put in place, but we could imagine what the situation might be like at some of the smaller warehouse operations where they don't face the same sort of reputational pressures. And then of course there's last mile delivery, where we see many workers employed in what we call gig economy jobs, these delivery drivers, some of them self-employed, some of them bogusly self-employed, living that, and they were already living very precarious lives, unable now to turn down work, and big pressures on increased demand for fulfillment. So I just wanted to bring up those workers, because these workers really are sort of tier one suppliers to many of the companies, and yet seldom get considered in these ways. And we should perhaps insist that, you know, these workers do enjoy fundamental rights, that they do receive adequate wages, paid in full and on time, that there are maximum working hours set, and health and safety is adhered to, and possibly, you know, some form of universal social protection for those workers as well. And then just finally from me about how we might promote the justice mechanism. I mentioned earlier the role of trade associations, and it is where many businesses can, you know, do have some leverage. How can we get trade associations to perhaps support the mechanism? And could this be suppliers' attitudes to the mechanism, and the fact that some will and some won't have been taking part in some of the things that we would like to see in the justice mechanism? Could that be a criteria for new contracts? If new contracts are being awarded by companies, then could these form part of the criteria through which they assess potential suppliers? Thank you, Datta. You're on mute. Datta, I think you're on mute.
Sir, yours is muted. You please unmute.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Thank you, Neil, for the highlighting the Montreal recommendations, provision of recruitment and employment agencies, and the role of trade associations, as well as the impacts. And finally, also for highlighting the problem faced by vulnerable workers in many sectors during this pandemic. I'll now go to the last presenter. The last presentation is by Tara Dermont. She's the head of sub-office, the International Organization of Migration. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, Hong Kong and China. Tara is the head of IOM, as I said, Hong Kong and China, where she leads a team committed to supporting diverse migrant populations and communities where they live. The current priorities include promoting ethical recruitment of migrant workers, strengthening access to justice for trafficked persons, facilitating the safe movement of vulnerable migrants, and continuing engagement with public and private sectors to realize the many positive benefits of labor migration for communities of origin and destination, as well as migrants themselves. I now call upon Tara to give us a presentation. Tara?
Thank you, Dato. I just want to make sure you can hear me before I continue.
Yes, I can.
Great. So
Proceed.
Thank you. Good evening and good day, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important call for business to act responsibly in ensuring justice for migrant workers on behalf of the International Organization for Migration. It is a real honor to be among such impressive and inspiring panelists. There has been a wealth of experience and knowledge shared already, so I will do my best to add from IOM's experience from our engagement with the private sector. So as I hope most of you know, IOM is committed to the principle that humane and orderly migration really does benefit migrants and society. As the UN's migration agency, we act with our partners to assist in meeting the growing operational challenges of migration management, to advance understanding of migration issues, to encourage social and economic development through migration, and to uphold the human dignity and well-being of migrants. To this end, IOM recognizes the business community as key stakeholders for the realization of these many benefits of migration. There are clearly links to be made between transitional justice and corporate accountability for human rights abuses. Unfortunately, as has been flagged in the latest and urgent civil society call for action and by speakers today, many businesses are failing in this accountability. Now, the important thing to remember, and which others have said, is that this failure is not new. Even pre-pandemic, migrants who represent less than 5% of the global workforce make up to 25% of modern-day slaves. Now, I'm pleased that Neil mentioned the importance of recognizing pervasive negative attitudes towards migrant workers as contributing to environments that are conducive to exploitation and even criminality. Now, another significant factor that has driven the exceptional vulnerability of migrant workers has been and continues to be debt. Pre-COVID, debt was primarily due to recruitment. Now, the cancellation or withholding of wages, wage theft, is clearly exacerbating this issue further. So adding to the wealth of findings that Isabel and Golda shared at the top of this webinar, a recent study conducted by IOM Bangladesh found that 55% of international returnees were in debt. This is more than 1 out of every 2 returning migrants. And of the population surveyed, 75% confirmed their desire to migrate again for work, despite the hardships that they had faced. So for years now, IOM, alongside other global actors, has been working to promote the ethical recruitment of migrant workers for its incredible potential for large-scale positive impact on business as usual. The UN's 2030 Agenda recognizes migration as an important global factor for development. Objective 6 of the Global Compact for Migration is to facilitate fair and ethical recruitment and to safeguard conditions that ensure decent work. Frankly, the current impact that we are seeing from this global pandemic has served to further strengthen our resolve in this regard. At the global level, IOM has led a highly consultative process with state and business actors to agree upon an international definition of ethical recruitment, the IRIS standard. Now, the IRIS standard and the adoption of ILO's definition of recruitment fees and related costs has brought much needed clarity for all stakeholders. This clarity means that large multinational enterprises with significant influence over global supply chains are in a unique position to encourage their suppliers and recruitment business partners to exceed national standards, especially where they are weak. Now, happily, we have seen an uptake in corporate commitment to ethical and responsible recruitment. However, IOM has learned from firsthand experience that businesses, like UN agencies, can be burdened by bureaucracy, with decision makers at varying levels of the organization and requiring buy-in from diverse departments. So there has been a strong need for internal education and sensitization as to what the risks are for migrant workers and what commitments and changes need to be made. Now, IOM has been highly responsive, conducting trainings with buyers, their suppliers, and recruitment business partners. And recently, these trainings have been updated, not only in their modality to virtual, but to also include IOM guidance for employers and recruiters specific to the COVID-19 context. Now, like others here today, IOM has also found industry coalitions to be an effective way for business to educate business. And IOM is happy to have productive partnerships with the likes of the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment and Responsible Business Alliance. Now, in terms of transitional justice mechanisms, such industry coalitions, business mechanisms, and multinational companies committed to international human rights standards can leverage their roles to engage with origin and destination country governments in a coordinated manner to support positive regulatory change and institutional reforms. Now, of course, we hope that the Montreal guidelines that Neil referenced will be a helpful tool for this. But as Murtaza flagged earlier, such institutional reform continues to be necessary because despite the uptake in high-level business commitments, ethical recruitment remains the exception, not the norm. Now, if we are indeed looking at a significant increase to employers of recruitment costs, which could be up to 40%, as Marie cited earlier, then the role of business to advocate for institutional reforms will be even more vital for ensuring that ethical recruiters can stay in business. As is, to redress the disparities between policy and practice, IOM has been working closely with business partners to develop practical tools to help them to operationalize their policy commitments. Now, great examples of tools in development with business right now include IOM's Migrant Worker Guidelines and IOM's Due Diligence Toolkit for Ethical Recruitment. Now, the development of both of these tools has been done in close coordination with corporate buyers and their network of suppliers and recruitment business partners. Now, the brilliant thing about tools like this for implementation is that they are simple and easy for suppliers to adopt and to adapt. So especially in response to current and new challenges facing migrant workers. So for example, the due diligence tool has a recruitment fees and costs calculator. Now this calculator can easily be updated to also account for any unpaid wages or necessary living subsidies and other such costs during this time. Now, the fact that these tools are being piloted right now with suppliers across the region and even around the world means that they will be tested against current COVID-19 challenges for migrant workers. Now, IOM will be publicly disseminating these tools and more in the coming months. I'm happy to share more information with anyone who would like some. Now, in closing, and given that I am presenting from Hong Kong, where the largest and most vulnerable population of migrant workers are domestic workers, I would also like to echo the call for solidarity and social responsibility and stress that it should extend beyond a business's accountability to their direct operations and supply chain. Business leaders should consider their community's reliance on migrant workers more broadly and lend support where they can. For businesses operating in urban centers, they can consider educating their staff about their responsibility to the domestic workers taking care of their children or their aging parents right now. Businesses can also think about how best to expand their corporate social responsibility to mitigate the terrible impact that the reduction of remittances is having in communities of origin for migrant workers already. Now, I could say a lot more on this, but I will close here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tara, for highlighting the issues faced by migrant workers as a consequence of the debts that they incur, especially so as a result of this pandemic. Also, the issues pertaining to ethical recruitment, fair and ethical standards that needs to be applied. And I'm especially, interested in this issue that you raised regarding industry coalitions. This is something that should be pursued vigorously and that should be encouraged. Thank you once again, Tara. I must apologize to all those who raised the questions earlier in the chat box. There was supposed to be a slot for question and answers, but we have run out of time. I must especially apologize to Mr. Thampi Nagarjuna, who raised several questions, Shanti Ranjan, Dong Tolentino, and William as well, who raised all those issues that need answers, but we do not have time. So I've got, according to my watch, about 5 minutes left, and we've got, I got to maintain time. We are finishing at 10 o'clock Malaysian time. That would be Indian time, 7:30, I think. Some final remarks from me before I hand over to Rula to do the opening. This session has shown us that business has a very important role in ensuring transitional justice for migrant workers. There is a dire need for institutional reforms to be made at the national level to ensure that migrant workers have the requisite access to justice. Access to justice is as important as justice itself, because without access, migrant workers will not be able to access and obtain justice for wage theft and other infractions of labor standards and labor laws. This session has also shown that there needs to be a broad collaboration between the civil societies, trade unions, governments, and business to ensure that migrant workers will be able to obtain their rights that is enshrined in law and policy. With that, I now call upon Rula Hamati from CCRM to give the concluding remarks. Once again, I apologize to all those who put up their hands, all those who put up questions, but we are just short of time. Please accept my apologies on behalf of the organizers. Thank you very much. Rula?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Datu. Maybe in conclusion, to reiterate some of the things we said in the beginning, as the campaign that is really talking about the issue of access to justice for workers and bringing up the issue of wage theft. We felt it is very important to talk about the role of business in all of this. Initially, we started by addressing governments. We started by addressing the global community, the UN system. But business is such a central role in the whole question of wages. It has a very big role to play in preventing some of the abuses we see, so that it doesn't become a question of how do we address the violations of when they occur, but also what can we do before such violations occur. I think this today's webinar was really a start of a conversation that we are hoping to take forward in the next few weeks, and to take forward in terms of concrete commitments. This webinar confirmed what we knew, what we suspected that it was already happening. What we knew that this whole issue of wages has really become one of the biggest issues of the COVID situation. And this webinar has also given us a lot to reflect on in terms of how do we leverage the business community in order to play its potential in protecting migrant workers. And this is a conversation we hope to continue on as we progress. But also we hope to continue in terms of maybe having another webinar later on talking about concrete commitments from business. What has business done in endorsing this issue? What has business done showing solidarity with migrant workers and the campaign? So hoping to continue that later on. Maybe also, of course, a big thank you to our resource people tonight, this evening, to Isabel, to Olga, to Murtaza, to Neil, to Tara, to Marie, and a big, big thank you to our fantastic moderator, Datu, for managing this session so seamlessly. Before closing, also to remind everybody to join us next week. Next week, we have a very important topic. We are talking about employer-tied visas. Employer-tied visas relate so much to what we were talking about today in terms of wage theft. We are having this global discussion about employer-tied visas in various parts of the world, comparing them, seeing how they play a role in also undermining migrant workers' rights, and how can we move forward. So please make sure to join us next week. A final reminder for those of you who have not signed the petition to please do so. This is very important. This is how we express our voices in this process. This is how we say that we care for justice, we care for migrant workers, we care for the issue of wage theft. So please make sure to sign the petition. Thank you all for those who have joined us. I know it is late in different parts of the world for this taking 2 hours of your time, and hope to be in touch later next week.
One student responded that they will log in, so I hope they do.
Parts of the world, this taking 2 hours of your time, and hope to be in touch later next week.
Maybe 150 we're expecting at least.
I hope they do.
We are live on YouTube also.
We have made it live in Twitter and YouTube, so many are watching there. We're expecting at least.
I hope they do.
We are live on YouTube also.
We have made it live in Twitter and YouTube. So
should we start now, or do you want to wait more? You have please unmute, Sada.
No, Professor Kamala, you can start now. It's 8 o'clock.
Okay.
YouTube.
Okay. Okay, somebody's having their microphone open, I think, but okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's morning here in Latin America, and good evening for India. And I would like to... Okay. I would like to thank the Global Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalists for this session, for inviting the Center of Research on North America from our National Autonomous University of Mexico. And of course, we hope this is an opportunity for a continuous and long-term exchange between the academics here in Latin America and in Mexico. We are welcoming everybody to the session number 17 of the panel on migration and diasporas. As you see, we invited academics from Ecuador, the United States, Venezuela, Brazil, of course, India and Mexico. And of course, I thank all the speakers who accepted to join us today, the Ambassador Nahida Sohban, Anjali Sahai, Alma Maldonado, Maria Amelia Viteri, Eliet Diaz and Luis Arnoldo, Erika Sarmiento, and of course to our faithful public who I understand you are tired after already 2 hours of another event today. So we will be happy to receive your feedback in the chat box. We will try to respond to some of the questions accordingly. Your comments, of course, are very important, will be considered for a series of policy briefs that we will do with the CISAN and the Global Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalists. And I will take great pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator today, my friend and co-author Amba Pandey. We've been collaborating for a couple of years now. She is a professor at the School of International Studies from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She did her PhD at the same institution. Her research focuses on Indian diaspora and international migration, and she has published various articles in national and international journals. She has also been a visiting faculty at the University of Amsterdam, University of South Pacific, Otago University in New Zealand, National University of Singapore, and Australian National University. So Amba, you can please start the session now. Thank you.
Thank you, Camelia. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Camelia. Thank you for your welcome and for your introduction. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, because we are really going global. And I thank GRFDT and CISAN for jointly organizing this very important session on student migration during post-COVID-19, Latin America and Asia, and having me as a moderator. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to moderate this discussion. To begin with, let me say some few things about as an introduction of this subject. So student migration is a widespread phenomenon across the world, and with globalization and internationalization of education, between the years 2000 and 2017, the number of international students increased from 2 million to 5.3 million. So it is an ever increasing number. And the trend is still rising till the time COVID struck. We have been discussing various aspects of migration in our webinars, but student migration has some specific features which marks it different from other trends. For the sending countries, which is mostly generally the developing countries, student migration is not only a source of brain drain, but also a drain on capital, drain on wealth. If we take the case of India, which is the second largest sending country, with numbers constantly increasing every year, the spending on tuition and hostel fee, etc., goes beyond 2.8 billion per year as far as the RBI, Reserve Bank of India data says. The second specific aspect of student migration is that both push and pull factors are equally important, or perhaps pull factors are more important than the push factors. There is no doubt that developing countries increasingly need high standard educational institutions for the growing number of their students, but the data proves that the educational institutions in the developed countries are more in need of the funds to sustain their expensive educational system. In the year 2018-19 only, international students made a huge financial contribution of $44.7 billion to the US economy. So you can see the kind of money international students are pushing into the developed economies. If we see India's case again, the rising gross enrollment ratio in higher education has created a huge gap in demand and supply for higher education, especially in the institutions of repute, which induce student migration. However, if we see the receiving institutions, studies point out that contribution from international students is the most important source of revenue for them, and they rely heavily on that. That is the reason why every year we see there are so many educational fairs to enroll in students by most of the prominent universities of the world. This is also the reason why we read reports about the fear of the closure of some of the Australian universities in case student migration is curtailed due to COVID-19. So international students make a huge contribution in the receiving economies. But from where is this fund coming from? A recent data from Migration Policy Institute show that 60% of the students in US rely on the personal or family sources. And this personal and family funding as far, at least in case of India, which I know of, is mostly coming from public sector banks. So the loans are taken from the public sector banks, paid in the institutions abroad for the education. So here we really see that there is a drain of capital. There is a realization among the Indian policymakers about this fact. And one of the recent policy changes, apart from many other changes included in the path-breaking new education policy, is that the government is going to invite top 200 institutions to open campus in India. In fact, this is a hugely welcome step and might be a beginning towards attracting international students in India. With this general introduction, we are going to start this extremely useful discussion today and enlighten ourselves with the case of various other countries and point of views. The general framework that we are going to follow is that each speaker will have 7 minutes, and please maintain this time. And the discussion will revolve around 4 major points. A very brief introduction of the specific country which the speaker is dealing. The second point is the impact of pandemic vis-a-vis the host country. The third is government initiative to deal with the situation. And the fourth point is suggestion for post-pandemic policies. So we have 6 presentations today, since one is a joint presentation. So we have 7 scholars with us today, 5 from Latin America and 2 from Asia, or rather 2 who are going to speak about Asia. I will also invite some of the eminent scholars who will join us today in between the discussion. So we will now begin. I really begin the discussion now. And the first scholar which I'm going to invite is Professor Mario Emilio Viteri. Professor Viteri is a social scientist and a professor of cultural anthropology, qualitative methods, gender, globalization, migration, and LGBT studies, as well as linguistics. She has examined several roles that race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and migrant status play in the various aspects of gender inequality, displacement, environmental degradation, lack of access, etc. Professor Viteri holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the American University in Washington, DC. So you can very well see that all these people, most of the scholars, I was going the bio notes, and I realized that all of them are generally themselves have migrated for higher studies to various countries. So it will be really interesting to see what they have to see in this regard. So please, Professor Viteri, can I invite you now? Please maintain the time for 7 minutes.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you again to Camelia for your kind invitation and for this wonderful space. As you well mentioned, Dr. Pandey, I was an international student myself in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and I cannot imagine my experience without having the cultural resources, the campus itself, the very diverse set of international and also local students that became my family during my PhD. And all that was easily enabled by being physically, right, present on campus and taking advantage of all the resources. And all those options have basically changed through the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot to talk about. I have chosen to focus in 3 specific things in order to be mindful about time. So as an anthropologist and a former international student in the United States, I'm concerned about how the pandemic will widen achievement gaps and will also widen, are already widening, education gap in terms of exclusion. And as we know, marginalized communities and racialized communities are those that are already suffering from those negative effects, thinking about economic mobility, social mobility, cultural mobility. Going back to my country, Ecuador, in coastal cities like Guayaquil, and I think that is similar to some parts in India, students and their parents from marginalized communities that do not have access to computer, iPads, smartphones, and or Wi-Fi need to do homework following instructions on the television. Uruguay, for example, has been able to address this gap by securing a computer and Wi-Fi for almost every kid, according to the Inter-American Bank's education blog. If we also continue looking at these gaps and how they have expanded, regrettably with the pandemic, they were always there, but now they are more visible and now they are more strengthened in a negative way, is that according to the Economic Policy Institute, as many as 35% of students in low-income and rural communities don't have internet access in the United States. Now, when this is measured by race and ethnicity, the gap is greater for African American and Hispanic Latino families. As you might imagine, this percentage is 3 times, 4 times higher if we look at countries like Ecuador. What does that mean? Few universities in countries like the United States will currently sponsor students to travel internationally. So the impacts in terms of economic losses for those universities, the students, the families, as well as experiential learning is very high. In the case of private universities in Ecuador who have fostered exchange programs abroad continuously, they might not be able to guarantee students' safety. For example, if a student is to get sick in a destination country, this will require additional health resources and otherwise. These within the context that visa programs have been suspended, consulates are closed, presidents like Donald Trump declared in April that international students' presence was hurting the economy, and many other political issues that, again, act together to expand the gap. In terms of policy options, the education gap. In terms of policy options, the way we have traditionally understood international education needs to be rethink. And also, as we rethink how and what does it mean to do virtual education, how do we adapt curriculum, subjects, pedagogies of learning and teaching to the current context? This will imply strengthening virtual communities of learning, supporting online research, improving online certificates, but these all require additional resources. Many governments, many universities, many schools will not be in the capacity to fulfill. We are still learning on how to adapt new technologies to create excellent quality through virtual teaching, learning. In the case of my university, is a private liberal arts university in Ecuador, is the highest rank in the country. We have the opportunity, because the university has the resources, of having been trained from week 1 when the pandemic was declared in better ways to do virtual teaching and all the technologies in place for professors. And again, this is not the case for the majority of the country. In terms of post-pandemic scenarios, I believe that one of the key words, which is flexibility, will continue to be the central word, as well as adapting to what the context allows. For example, partial reopening of laboratories like medical and or engineering and or math laboratories. In the case of School of Arts, partial reopening of studios. What does that imply for both students as well as the administration in the universities, as well as families, considering that there have been letters written and even specific claims made by parents, families, and students in countries like the United States to ask for a reduction of the registration and the tuition, provided that students are not using the campus facilities. And we have seen universities in the United States having to lower down their registration costs. So we will continue to see a change and a negotiation between also the extremely high costs of education, especially private education, and how families, parents, students negotiate and navigate those high costs. As I close
please
this
finish up,
intervention, the mechanisms we're currently learning from the pandemic will have a lasting effect in how we craft curriculums. Campus might just never look the same. COVID-19 has also provided us with this opportunity to revisit what was working and what was not working in general education, and a chance to pause, revisit, adjust, change. The world has forever changed, and with it, the pedagogies and subjectivities involved in learning and teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. And you really raised some of the very pertinent points here about the rising gap due to the excess of technology, and whether, these online, this whole process of online courses, and whether they are going to reduce the registration fee, etc. But I really think that there is also a question of whether the students are actually ready to take these online courses fully, even those who are capable of accessing the technology. That is also a point. Thank you very much for this this talk. Now let me invite Professor Ambassador Nahida Shoban from Bangladesh. Ambassador Shoban is a Bangladeshi diplomat who is the first female diplomat in Middle East. She served as Jordanian ambassador from January 1st, 2020. Earlier, she served as a Director General of UN Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let me add to this that Ambassador Shoban is a very academically oriented diplomat, and it is always a pleasure to listen to her. So I invite Ambassador Shoban, please. Shobhan, Ambassador Shobhan.
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Ambe. Good afternoon from Jordan. You have humbled me a little bit. I'm not that academically oriented person. I'm still trying to learn. So my advantage in this kind of platform is to learn from you and all the other speakers, like big professors. So I feel a bit humbled to be here, but thank you very much for inviting me. A big thanks to JRFDT and CISAN for inviting me to be a panelist here, and on top of everything for organizing this session, and very much dedicated to the international students, because in our discussions on migration issues and on migrants, this is a big chunk of population that we always tend to avoid and sometimes forget. So I think this is a very good start, at least to start talking about it. And even during all the negotiations that we had previously, where I had the opportunity to engage, like the negotiations on inclusion of migration in 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, or in GFMD, or in Global Compact on Migration, we never had the opportunity to include the international students, and this is a big gap. Why big gap? I'll come to that later, but let me just give you an idea. I have 4 areas to look into. First, since I'm coming from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has sends out a huge number of international students abroad from Bangladesh. So I'll focus a little bit on the Bangladesh scenario, then the global scenario, and some of the main challenges, and lastly, what can be done. So to talk about Bangladesh, as I was saying, that in general, we have a huge number of population, 170 million people in Bangladesh. And as per the UNESCO's statistics in 2017, there were more than 60,000 people students going abroad for tertiary education. And most of them, the students from Bangladesh used to be mostly going to like USA, Canada, and UK. But very recently, Malaysia has become the highest destination, having around 23,000 students receiving from Bangladesh in Malaysia from 2018. But apart from that, USA, Australia, UK, and Canada are top four, apart from Malaysia, are the top four destination of the students from Bangladesh. And USA, Bangladeshi students are among the top 10 countries of origin in the USA. Most of the topics that they go abroad for studying are like medicine, medical sciences, IT, and business. The reasons, it is mostly, I would say, the capacity in the financial terms or capacity in the economic terms. Most of these students are self-financed, but not much of debt story here. And a big chunk also among these 60,000 plus students get also scholarships from abroad, from the countries of destination as well. Huge number of people in last 3 years are coming up from the middle class of Bangladesh. And you can see the middle class is enlarging. And according to UN statistics, by 2025, it will increase 3 times and coming up something like about 35 million people in Bangladesh in the context of middle class. And these are the majority of people that coming out from Bangladesh to study abroad. For what the government has been doing during the COVID, there has not been any financial support to any of the international students. It is mostly self-financed and self-choice. But in terms of repatriation, government has been engaging to repatriate international students from abroad to Bangladesh when their university is closed. Now let's take a little bit of global scenario. According to UNESCO, also in 2017, the UNESCO statistics shows that there were 5.3 million people known as international students around the world. And almost half of these students went to USA, UK, and thirdly to China. And countries of origins are firstly from China, then Russia, India, and also from Austria. I would say that whether we need to look at it in a different way, maybe sometimes. I always try to look at things like half glass full or half glass empty. And in terms of international students, my story would be half glass full, I would say. Because we need to look at it, whether it is about having the challenge of financing, or whether to term that financing as investment, because education is a good investment. And for many of the countries of origins, if it is from the developing states, I would say it would give students, international students, a lot of opportunity to have a very good global exposure. And also it can close down a big knowledge gap that we see between the developing countries and the developed countries. And secondly, also a very good opportunity for an exposure of the international environment and international education environment. So it's making the international students a part of global citizenship. And that's the half glass full from my part. Now, it doesn't go without any challenges. Let us talk about a little bit on the, let me talk about a little bit on the challenges. I don't know if I have much time. How many minutes?
Two more minutes, please.
Okay, I'll finish in 2 more minutes. So I'll pick 3 major challenges. One is the registration or application processes. In some of the countries, it is quite hassling. And in that way, I think the students that really deserves to go abroad to study and then come back misses the opportunities. And those who are not like a valuable asset may slip down because of the application processes and registration processes. One big issue that needs to be taken into account is the situation of the mental health. because a lot of students, when they go abroad, a lot of them might have financial issue. As you have already mentioned, Dr. Amba, I was listening to you about the debt situation, but even if they are not in a debt situation, they still have this, pressure of financing and the stress of studying, and also the stress of being in a completely new environment. So mental health is something of the international students that needs to be looked into. And now let me take a look at what has happened through because of the COVID-19. A huge situation of uncertainty, whether the courses are going to be, continued, whether the students will be able to continue with their dorms or the housing, whether they will be able to come back, and if they come back to the country of origin, whether they will be able to go back and continue their studies. So these are the another areas. And I think that and another point, sometimes in some countries, not all countries, but in many countries, a lot of international students are also a victim of stigma. So that is something that needs to be looked into. Now, what can be done? I would say that a lot of proper training, and also in change in policy making. Can I take 30 seconds? Yeah. Policy changes in the countries of destination and countries of origin is very much required to help these students and also to help this mobility. Mental health should be taken care of by the institutions as well as by the host community. And also lastly, I think that a new mechanism that we should be looking into, that needs to take into account the crisis situation and also include the international students and their challenges, in order to make both the countries of origin and the countries of destination to gain from brain gain, not brain drain. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shobhan. This is really interesting, and thank you for seeing the half glass full and seeing that we are creating the human capital. That's a big thing. But the problem arises when there is a distress migration of students, since we are not able to provide the suitable educational standards to them. So thank you very much for this. So our next speaker I would like to invite is Professor Alma Melando. She received her PhD from in higher education from Boston College, and her supervisor, it seems, was Philip G. Eltbatak. He's a very, very prominent scholar in this field. She served as assistant professor in the Center for Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona, USA, till 2009. And since 2010, she is the researcher at the Department of Educational Research for the Center of Research and Advanced Studies in Mexico. She is also an author of numerous articles and books on higher education in Mexico and in other countries. She is also the editor of education blog called Distancia por Tiempos. So I would like to invite Dr. Alma Melando, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amba.
I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the names correctly.
Well, this happens also to us regarding your last name, so I think we are even here. But thank you very much for the kind invitation and for this introduction. Thank you very much to Camelia for invited me to this panel. I truly appreciate this opportunity to talk in this panel about this very important topic between Asian and Latin American colleagues. And also I appreciate that most of us are women, and that's also nice, a nice discussion. And I would like to talk about three main issues, and taking the opportunity to put some ideas here regarding migration and the current situation of the pandemic. First of all, let me say that universities in general, as we know, they are very ancient and they have a long history, but universities have survived at least 9 major pandemics along their history. So this is only one more. It's not the pandemic, the most lethal pandemic actually that we have survived, and we hope we will find a solution regarding this pandemic. But universities have a long history, and I think this is one of these crises where we need to redefine and rethink about our major issues. I agree with Maria Amelia about what this represents in terms of facing new challenges for universities. And I will like to start with one example here. First of all, universities are international. This is another characteristic that we know about universities since their creation. By definition, they are international. But there are several discussions that, at least in my case, I tried to avoid for a long period of time regarding internationalization and universities. And one has to do with what is an international student. And for a long time, I didn't want to really address the debate on to what extent an international student can be an online student. And I think this is the moment where we have to redefine this, and we need to discuss again, because in my opinion, and given my training, I also studied in the US and I was a professor in the US and so on. International student, one main component has to do with moving geographically to another country and have the experience and live the experience. And obviously the European Union came to redefine what was an international student, because they also define it by domestic, non-domestic. I mean, there were all these different terms to define international student. But in terms of online students, that was more difficult always, because we were saying, well, it is not exactly an international student if they don't have the experience. But now that we all became online professors, online students, I think it's a good moment to reconsider this definition and to rethink what is the way we are defining this. And this is just one example. The other, of course, has to do with migration. I mean, this pandemic has implied different challenges regarding migration. And I will use two quick examples in terms of the time. One is the recent debate in the US regarding the migration and regarding this issue on if you are not taking classes at the campus, you won't be considered an international student, or you will lose your rights as an international student and you have to be deported. This is one thing, and obviously the issue was solved, fortunately, in the US in terms of allowing them to take online classes. But I will put you the other example in the case of Mexico. Here we are discussing that if you are not in the country, you are not allowed to receive the national scholarships as an international student because you have to be in the country. And this is, again, the other side of the debate, but it has a lot of implications in terms of migration and the meaning of and the rights of international students. Another issue that we need to discuss is what is going to be happening with the most vulnerable students in this context. And obviously, Maria Amelia mentioned several situations in Latin America that we are facing here in terms of inequities, the gaps in terms of access to technology. I mean, these are issues that developing countries are facing, and we all are facing this situation. The sub-minister of higher education in Mexico the other day said that it is expected to lose at least 8% of the total enrollment of higher education because the pandemic situation. This is probably very optimistic to think about only 8% will drop. But this represents at least more than 3,100 students in the case of Mexico that we might miss. So in this context, what is the situation of internationalization and higher education? Well, one of the issues that now we have to discuss in our countries is how relevant is going to be internationalization, because in a context with all these necessities, with all these problems, obviously the main one being health, the health issue, internationalization won't be a priority. That's the real situation in a country like Mexico. So the big challenge is how can we continue putting the topic in the agenda? How can we continue saying it's still important, no matter what is the way we are doing?
Conclude. Please conclude.
Yes, I am finishing. So how to put this issue, how to become, and how to redefine the way we are saying still we need to put this in the agenda of the institutions, in the governments, and I think these issues together with others like access, inequity, quality, is going to be there. So I will leave the discussion here, but I hope we will have time to continue debating. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Maldonado. This was a very interesting presentation in the sense that you just gave the whole picture of Mexico, and this was really interesting. And all of us turning into online teachers and students turning into online students. So where is this whole challenge of the opportunity for exposure which international education brings is have to be seen, and how the developing countries are going to actually address this issue is also to be seen. Thank you very much for this. And as I had said earlier, that we have some very eminent scholars from all over the world with us now. So I would like to invite from the Rio de Janeiro Federal University, Juliana Fogul, Professor Juliana Fogul. Can you please come and say your opinion, give your opinion very briefly about this whole situation? Professor Juliana, are you there? I think she is. We cannot hear you. Please unmute yourself.
I think you may hear me now.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And we would love to hear something from you on this issue.
Yes, we are dealing with different difficult topics here in Brazil because mainly if you see the things that Brazilian students and Indian students and all of these foreign students of international programs bring to the country they go, this is not being talked about. And we are having a discussion about whether the foreign students must or not go to the countries, but I think this is a thing that it's very bad because we are seeing that the migration is progressively going into the defense security programs. And even with Trump, with all of the barriers they put in the foreign to come in, and the Mexicans and the Indians, and we are having like so many problems with that and losing so much, because science is made with integration, with internationalization, and the COVID-19 programs are showing this to us, that we cannot work in one country or close in one country, because the frontiers, they do not exist like we used to know from a time above. So we have like cultural frontiers, new cultural frontiers from these groups that goes from India to US. We have economic frontiers, international and financial frontiers. So this is a very strange topic. And I think this discussion is a very good discussion. And we have to achieve a lot of progress, because when you stop the international migrations of students, we are stopping the learnings and all of the things that these students brings to their countries, that they provide, and the countries that they goes to. And here in Brazil, we have a federal program that are losing so many students now, that calls Ciências Sem Fronteiras, that the government puts to internationalize our science and our students, learning that we need to go abroad, we need to go to other places. So I think I would like to propose or ask for the people, how do they see that this progressive, how do they see, how are we going to lose in terms of going forward in our academic discussions and academic achievements with these limitations from students to going abroad?
Ma'am, please.
I'll just conclude it.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to suggest that please write your questions in the chat box, so that in the end we can take it up if in case we have time. So I also want to invite Professor João Carlos Clevenzeira. She's also from Brazil, and I invite you to say, give your opinion on the subject, please. Can you hear?
Hello.
Yes. Hello, Professor. Please go ahead with your view.
Is Luis Ordóñez? Are you talking about Luis Ordóñez? I didn't understand.
Can you speak in English? Yeah.
Or Professor Camilla can translate.
Okay.
Maybe he cannot. Okay, maybe we can give the floor to somebody else. Meanwhile,
Okay.
He cannot put on his microphone, but maybe later. I suggest.
Okay. So I would also like to invite Professor Bhatt, who has been a constant support to us, and he was kind enough to grace this session. Professor Bhatt, can I invite you, please, to give your views?
Sir, muted, sir. To keep on mute.
Please unmute yourself, Professor Bhatt.
Thank you, Professor Amber, for giving me this wonderful opportunity and inviting me to have a brief comment on the presentations. I think they're very brilliant presentations, right from the first presentation, which emphasized on cultural resources. You know, the students migrate because they are being pulled into the stream wherever the destination is. Like I would say US is the main destination for many of the Indians. And I'm speaking from Andhra Pradesh or now Telangana. And it's one of the areas, hinterlands from where huge number of students every year migrate to the US. Now, this migration is facilitated by a huge diaspora which exists there. And secondly, there is a chain linkage which connects the students there. So it's a process wherein migration of the students is not just student migrating, but it's a migration for a longer time. Every student who goes to the US, for instance, would not think of coming back until they prove themselves they cannot make it. So it's a stepping stone for the future life. And so student migration is only an initial step to go ahead. And therefore, it's same for all the developing countries. Most of the developed countries, all the cream of their population, student population gets absorbed in these countries, and perhaps you find a new kind of empire building, like we had earlier, the colonial empire building, and today it is a new colonialism under which the elites, the intelligentsia of all the countries, from developing countries in particular, assembles in certain locations, and that is one of the important points which need to be looked into. And I think.
Please conclude, sir.
I think you can go ahead. I was just only emphasizing on international experience. The COVID has given some kind of a problem for international exposure. So the international migration of the students and the experience will not be the same as it would be unless we reopen, which is happening now. I heard US colleges are opening, and already students have started moving for their academic courses now. Thank you, Professor Amber.
Thank you. And I would also like to invite quickly Professor Raj Bardole. Can you also please give your opinion? Is Professor Raj there? Okay, so in case in case Professor Raj is not there, so can I invite again Professor Zhao from Brazil? Are you there, sir?
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
You can hear me now?
Both of them are there.
Yes.
Please wait a minute. Camelia,
Raj,
Professor Raj, please continue. Then we will again invite.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I would say that the discussion is interesting. 2 points I want to make is, one, that while the exposure to international universities is important in person, not online, this only takes care of few people who are able to afford to go to the US or to Canada or England or wherever they go to. So this does not actually give the opportunity to most people who would like to be in similar situations. So this is, again, building classes, elitism. And some of them have the intention of, including myself, I went to the UK to study and never came back to my country in Dominica, to work for that matter. So there's this intention built into when you go abroad that you will stay there because your skills are not going to be used. That's one point. That how do we expand access and experience of other countries who are not, other students who are not able to pay for their education. And here I have a suggestion. As you know, the campuses are being annexed. The US campuses are being set up in certain countries. For example, in the Middle East, you've got the Cornell University, you have the Hopkins University campus, and it gives chance to local as well as other international students in the region. So what I'm proposing is that in this situation now, in terms of internationalizing education for lots of people or giving that kind of experience, is one way is to see how sister institutions could be set up. Now in Dominica, we had this medical school which was some university in the US. They set up medical schools in a couple of islands, Grenada, Dominica, a couple of other places. And their reason was different, twofold: to make education cheaper and accessible to more students who cannot get into medical schools in the US. and then they spend 1 year or 2 years of the last of their studies
Please
back in
conclude,
the.
Professor Raj.
Yeah, I'm going to conclude by saying to give more opportunities to people, more students for international education. Perhaps this idea of having sister institutions or having some kind of arrangement between the UK or whatever, that's one. Two is to see also to revisit actually what is international education if people are not coming back, if these graduates are not coming back to serve their country. Is this more for personal gains or social gains? So I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your inputs, Professor Raj. This was really very enriching. And yes, I mean, the way you said about, these opening sister institutions, campuses, this is really a welcome step. I too, agree with you fully. So now I will invite Professor Carlos Calazarawa from Brazil.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. Hello, yes.
It's a pleasure being here in this morning. I am a student of Brazil. I'm working on LABIME, Laboratory of Study Immigration of the UERJ in Rio de Janeiro. And I asked to the teacher Erica Sarmiento about the last court of in education to the government.
Okay.
Understand, teacher?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your inputs. This was, it was just a random invitation, and I'm really grateful that, we could hear some more views on this. So now to move on, I would like to invite now Professor Luis Arnaldo. Professor Arnaldo, he is a PhD in biochemistry from MIT. And completed the advanced management program at Venezuela. He was a professor at Medical School of the University of Venezuela and presided various academic associations. He also is an executive secretary of the Permanent Commission for Science and Technology of the House of Representatives at the National Congress of Venezuela. So we really have the pleasure of having him. And this paper is a joint paper. So along with Professor Arnaldo, we have Dr. Elith Diaz. She is a PhD in business administration from University of Venezuela, a master's in social psychology from the University of Barcelona, Spain. She worked as an associate professor at the University of Venezuela for 10 years. And since then, she has been cooperating with the Interconectados Foundation for Venezuela. She also conducted research in this field with the group of Latin American Collaborative Research. So I invite you both to present your paper, please. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know. I am waiting to have the picture shown. Is that okay?
Sir, your voice is not clear. Please.
Perhaps you can turn your video off. It can. Maybe we can.
Oh, I should talk my video. Okay, I will take it off then. No.
Okay. Okay, it's better now.
Can you show the video now? No, I can show my video. Okay, I will speak, but I understand the video is not showing now. Is that correct? Or you are going to show my video? You are going to show the video?
No. What I'm saying, Luis, is that if we cannot hear you, maybe it's better to turn your video off so that we can hear you better.
Okay, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I can go on and just speak like everybody else, or you rather show my video. If you show my video, I will have 1 more minute to comment at the end because the video lasts only 6 minutes.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. We can hear you.
Okay, okay, I will go ahead. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you to the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism and the Center for Research on North America of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. We would like to talk now, myself and Dr. Elliot Diaz from Fundación Interconectados Venezuela, about a concept, which is the flipped forum, like flipped classroom, and social capital development in the context of a student migration due to COVID-19. What do we mean by flipped forum and social capital development? From our studies on Venezuelan diaspora, and everybody knows that in Venezuela now we have a big political problem, so we have to move between politics and policies in order to understand the Venezuelan diaspora and the students that might be studying abroad, or students which their families went abroad within this diaspora and are studying abroad. How do we do to cover for that capital drain, from that brain drain that we are having of people leaving the country, and much more with this COVID-19 problem? We have been studying the possibility of developing social capital instead, using the technologies, using information and communication technologies to build social capital. And in this time of diaspora, we understand that with COVID-19, more than ever, peer-to-peer electronic communities must be developed more in these times, and they are very clearly related to student migration. Peer-to-peer communication directly will allow to exchange information, distribute tasks, or execute transactions. So some people even think that the technologies are a panacea. But what is the problem and in the world? Is trust. How do we trust each other? When you use technologies, it's even harder to develop trust. We all know from the sociology that primary groups develop trust through life, family, country, and so on. When these students go abroad, it's very easy for them to generate bonds, what is called bonding social capital with their relatives, with people from the same country. But how we do for them that remain in the country, how we develop bridging social capital, which is, according to Putnam, the value assigned to social networks between socially heterogeneous groups. We must develop bridging social capital with the students that are abroad, people that are in the country, much more if they are researchers. If they are in science doing research, we are interested in having all that knowledge available for the people that are in the country. And with the COVID-19 and the lack of possibility of get together, of moving freely about the countries, much more our development of flipped forums is in the chat my email, and I put it a reference. Is in Spanish, the paper, but you can translate it into the use of the technologies as a motivational element to work in science. Let me explain very quickly what a flipped forum is. Imagine that today's forum that we are having, this very important and interesting forum between the Americas, Asia, and Europe, people in Europe, people all over the world, we have done it in the following way. Before the forum, before today, 15 days ago, all of us put up in the web our talks, 6-7 minutes talks, put it 15 days before. We have 15 days time to see those talks, to see the presentations, make notes, ask the opponent, the professors who gave the talks, what to clarify points, make forward ideas, and then use this time rather than watching each other for 7 minutes times is over 40 minutes that we will be watching each other, going directly to discuss things that could come up from the previous watching of the presentations. What we have been doing for 8 years now with the Flipped Forum in our country is to have in a national meeting, the Venezuelan Association for the Advancement of Science, we have these Flipped Forums where people abroad, people in the country present their talks previously on the web, and the day of the meeting, we come to join together to build trust precisely. With the students abroad, we think that the bonding of social capital is already developed. They are in contact with people from their same countries, but they have to build bridging social capital. They have to start meeting people in their own field of research in other countries, in their origin country, and in the recipient country. If I am doing a PhD in biochemistry, in neurochemistry, I want to know who is doing neurochemistry in my country, in other words, in other parts of the world. We can use the Flipped Forum for them to put up their presentations, have interactions and trust, and therefore building that social capital that is needed in our countries. In a sense, that's what we are doing today. Okay, but let's face it, today we have a 2 minutes, I would take 1 more minute. Today, we have to understand each other, something that is very hard because we speak English, more or less rusty English, and we have to understand what we are trying to say and to interact in order to do for further work. That's why I put my Gmail, I put a print, link to a print, and I put a link to our blog, which you can read in English. Students which are to cover for that. In fact, the presentation I have prepared for you, I have it in Hindi, the page for the people here from India to understand. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope we develop a lot of social capital with this kind of activity. That's it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. And this was really interesting to see, how actually the social capital that you talk about is the real strength of human capital. It is where that human capital can be used to its best. So if we can really develop this will be very interesting. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Dr. Anjali Sahai, who is an associate professor, Department of Political, Legal and International Studies, Gannon University. Dr. Sahai is a multifaceted personality. Apart from being a program director of various programs in her university, she is also the resident faculty of CNET for teachers, it seems. Dr. Sahai also successfully runs the Model UN program at Gannon, East Carolina, and Old Dominion universities. She has been doing this for almost 2 decades. Her area of research is on international migration, international relations. Her book, titled Indian Diaspora in the United States, Brain Drain or Brain Gain, has received much appreciation in the academic world. And apart from being an educator, Dr. Sahai is also a leader, author, researcher, and a performing artist of Indian classical dance. That's very interesting. And she is trained in Kathak, and we really hope to see her performance sometime. I welcome Dr. Sahai. Please go ahead with your 7 minutes. Can you hear us, Professor Sahai?
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey, for your kind introduction. I'm going to try to do this in 7 minutes, but it will be hard. So I would like to start with a very brief introduction part that I always like to add. So I'm also an international student that came to the United States 21 years ago. So this topic is very dear to my heart because of our own educational experiences that we faced in the United States. One of my broad conclusions, and I'm starting with conclusions so that I can flow from that. These are the overall conclusions that I have. There are two main impacts on migration currently. These are both political and health. And if we look at these as independent variables, both of these are impacting student migration. And overall, I'd like to believe that the political weighs in much higher than the health will in the long term, because as an optimist, I believe that this pandemic will eventually lessen and die away. But it's a political factors that have always impacted student migration into the United States. This is also not the first time that an external event has directly impacted student immigration into the United States. One of the biggest events was 9/11, and we saw post 9/11 how student migration was heavily impacted in the United States. So I'm not going to go over the statistics for Indian immigration into the United States for international students because various presenters as well as Dr. Pandey, you already mentioned in your introduction to this webinar today. But just to reiterate that Indians are the second highest international student cohort in the United States after China, followed by South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. So these are the top five countries of origin for international students. And I will focus on Indian immigration, student immigration, because I was told to focus on the Indian immigration per se. So in terms of field of study, as can be probably guessed, most Indian students opt to study in the STEM fields. Engineering, business management, math, and computer science are the top three fields of study for international students from India. And also they tend to be almost entirely in the graduate programs as compared to the undergraduate programs in the United States. So moving on to the impact of the pandemic versus the host country, I'd like to take a completely political view on this and start with saying that while the world was grappling with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and how this would impact the immigration, it's very important to note that even prior to the pandemic even began, in terms of the current U.S. administration already largely cut off immigration to the United States as part of its overall immigration policy, and this just continued during the pandemic. We have various examples, such as the processing of new visas for H-1Bs and the new student visas. All of this went down dramatically. When the pandemic actually started, the USCIS, which is charged with the processing for immigration applications, they had already closed. They were not processing any other new applications. So there are various political executive orders that came out that directly impacts the student migration. And if we look at particularly the year 2016 and 2017, we note that the growth fell sharply in 2017 and 2018 academic years. Prior to these years, the Indian student immigration had actually doubled in numbers, and that was a notable increase in the size of student immigration into the United States. But after 2016 and 17, if we look at those years, then this numbers dropped down dramatically. And to highlight how important this is, if you look at the Indians enrolled in graduate level computer science and engineering programs, they declined sharply by almost 67% in the U.S. universities, and that's pretty good number to take into account. So Prior to the pandemic, I just want to mention one related aspect that's pretty important for the students' decision to migrate. Eventually, the student migrant who comes to the United States, the end result of that is that they expect 3 years of optional practical training. And after that, they expect to get jobs in the United States. So when there were announcements that no new H-1Bs would be processed in the United States, that had a trickle-down effect on new student applications as well. So I'm almost at 6 minutes, so I'm going to go straight to the COVID hurdles. Clearly, some of the biggest hurdles has been the ban on international flights. So students cannot come into the country. But when it was announced, as we've already talked about it, that if you cannot be in a complete face-to-face classrooms, then you cannot be considered international students. This would already have a direct impact on students who would want to come to the United States. So I have 3 or 4 clear impacts that I would like to mention as part of my conclusion. So with the pandemic, we see for Indian student immigrants that there will be a definite dip in the demand for US student visas for this year, for both China and India specifically. Second, universities will face a fall in revenue, especially if a large number of Indian students stay away because they are enrolled in the graduate STEM programs. And in an article that I have published previously, a lot of universities are looking to open remote campuses in various Asian countries. So we're just going to see more of that. More restrictive immigration policies in the United States will lead to a shift in the flow of international students to Canada, which has seen as much as a 127% increase in the last 4 years of Indian students moving out of the United States and moving into Canada because of their, more open door policy. And this is the last thing that we have all talked about, is that with the global talent war, that every country is trying to retain the best and the brightest, especially in the STEM fields. What we are now seeing is a self-inflicted American brain drain since the election of President Trump in the last 4 years. So my overall recommendation, I'm out of time, is that leaders of both countries have not looked at migration. We have seen President Trump's visit to India in February and Prime Minister Modi's visit to United States last year. It was a very warm, engaging partnership between the two leaders, but we are not seeing that warmth flow into the migration side of things and how that can be eased up for people traveling from India to the United States. So I'll stop now and maybe take questions during the Q&A session at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sahai. This was really interesting. And in your discussion, when you pointed out that there was a decrease in Indian students in US in those 2 years, that trend was being diverted to Australia, and Australia was gaining the numbers actually during the time when it was decreasing in US. The data says that. So thank you very much for this. So now I would like to invite our last speaker, Dr. Erica Sarmento. She has done her PhD in history of America. And she is a professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro and a coordinator of the Immigration Studies Laboratory. She is a researcher on the National Council of Scientific and Technological Development and the Research Support Foundation for the state of Rio de Janeiro. I invite you, please. Go ahead. Yeah.
Good morning, good evening. I speak from Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this forum. Thank you, Camellia. Sorry for my English. In recent years, I have dedicated myself to speaking Spanish because I'm a professor of history of Latin America. I begin. According to the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs of the U.S. Department of State, Brazil ranks 19 among the countries that send the most students to the United States. In total, there were 16,059 Brazilians enrolled in the academic years 2018-2019. During that period, there were roughly 1,095,000 foreign students in the USA, an increase of 0.5% over the previous year. The USA Embassy also stated that the country remains the top host of international students globally. It's also crucial to point out that American universities profit handsomely from the tuition and fees which foreign students pay to the institutions. In fact, foreign students represent 5.5% of the enrollment in higher education institutes. Douglas Trump's decisions will have important impacts on the budgets. However, as long as the students have at least one class online, they can still get a visa. But again, to do so, these students are required to participate in at least one in-person class. A corollary issue of these distinctions has to do with the optional practical training year, OPT, a work permit allowed to foreign students after they concluded their studies. It's possible that those who had stayed back in Brazil taking class online will not be considered 100% active students and may be denied OPT. This is a major concern for Brazil students who aim to access the labor market in the United States once they concluded their studies. Moreover, there is no meaningfulness in taking a course in American university completely online. That's because the experience of living abroad is the quintessential part of studying abroad. To be sure, we are dealing with Brazilian higher education students who, even in a country as large as Brazil, represent only a small number of the overall population that gets into a graduation course. Even so, besides higher education students, the case of visiting professor or postdoctoral scholar is also telling, as some have scholarships from the Brazilian government, and they too may lose access to the United States. However, they are already decreasing progressively, and that it's important to note, although current Brazilian politics do not prioritize science and scholarships cuts mainly in the humans area. In this regard, Rafael Monteforte Ferreira, the president of the Brazilian Association of Students Abroad, BRASA, also highlighted in an interview given on August 7, 2020, that the Brazilian situations, the first, Brazil institutions fellow continue to receive assistance regardless of whether they will attend in class or remote class. Second, students who will start the semester in September remotely can take their class. They just will not have their statutes validated by the American government. When they return to the United States, they must revalidate their status in order to enter the country. In the case of Brazilian, one of the challenges encountered is the temporary closures of consulates in the country due to the coronavirus pandemic. Most of the students who start their studies in the next semester have not obtained their visas and must face a delay since some consulates are still closed. The situation of the Brazilian students communities, that the third point, in the United States is hampered by the closing of borders. Even with the revocation of the measure that had been announced on July 16, American borders remain closer to foreigners we have been in Brazil in the last 14 days. Because of this, even students who have their face-to-face class cannot travel directly to the United States. In addition, another difficulty faced by Brazilian students is the reflection of the financial crisis linked to the pandemic. Since the Brazilian currency, the real, has depreciated considerably against the dollar. Consequently, it's difficult or impossible even for middle class to travel to the United States or to Europe. Recently, a group of students met to ask the Brazilian government for help in trying to negotiate an exception agreement for national students with active ties in North American institutions. Brazilian students complained that Europe's were exempt, and they want Itamaraty to negotiate with the American government so that Brazilian students are also exempt. They consider that in education, travel is essential, and that country like Canada, for example, already accepts all students from the travel restrictions. The group of Brazilian students created an Instagram campaign to pressure the Brazilian government to take a stand. One of the posts says, international students from all countries must be accepted for travel restrictions. The students say, we need the supports. A negotiation can be made. Our government always say that it has a good relationship with the government there. That's totally possible. If it were a health issue, countries like Mexico will be banned. In general, the situation for Brazilian students likes to get more complicated in relation to their return to Brazil from the United States as well. Maybe this situation will be extended until the vaccine arrives because probably Brazil will continue to be one of the countries with high rates of infection. Even so, it's necessary to implement return policies for students, perhaps agreement between countries so that students can start their school semester in September and can quarantine before integration to society at large. So what policy should have in Brazil or in other Latin American countries to the improvement of the students' migration during the pandemic period? One of the policies that Brazil could adopt for student migration during the pandemic should be conducted through the Brazilian embassy through agreement with the United States regarding the commitment of these students to quarantine in the United States before starting classes.
Please conclude. Please conclude.
Okay, I conclude. I conclude with important things. In the last week, the Brazilian government cut 18% of the Ministry of Education budget and increased the military's budget. This means a loss of millions in Brazilian education, scholarships. This government's priority is not education. That much is clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was very interesting. And yes, you know, the government to government agreements can actually resolve some of the issues that this COVID has brought and solve some of the problems that the students are facing. So basically, we have done with all the speakers, but in the end, we also have the pleasure of having Professor Vinod Khadria with us, who has worked extensively on student migration. So can I invite him for 2 minutes, sir? Professor Khadria, sir, are you there? Professor Sadanand, Dr. Sadanand, is Professor Khadria here?
he's here, but maybe, we can do one thing. We can have some questions are there.
Actually, we are actually running short of time.
Yes,
We are
yes.
already, but if someone has a question and he or she can come directly and ask, we have some of the issues raised in the chat box, but several of these issues are already addressed by the speakers, so I can invite some of the speakers to ask direct, audience to ask direct questions, address themselves.
Can I mention something, meanwhile?
Yes, please do, yeah.
I think the discussion was fascinating, and I really learned a lot from the different contexts. But I think one thing we were missing in the discussion was the role of internationalization at home. Is this concept that has been developed to try to, as you mentioned it, going abroad is very expensive for everybody and for developing countries, and very few have the chance, some of us, to study abroad, to move geographically.
For 2 minutes, you can give your.
Sadaji, please unmute yourself and speak. Yeah, please go ahead, Professor. Yeah.
So I think this is another debate, not only about redefining what is an international student now, but we all in many ways are doing internationalization at home online. So I think this is a new a moment where we have to redefine, reshape this idea, because as it was mentioned by Erica, most of our governments are facing these budget cuts, and we will be facing these financial constraints regarding internationalization. So we need to be more creative. We need to start rediscussing the role of this online, internationalization, and so I only wanted to say that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Is Professor Kadria there?
Yes, he's back.
Okay, Professor Kadria, please, can we have your views also on this important topic?
Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah. But it was a fascinating session. Yeah. And I had just stepped out because I was attending right from 5:30, the other one. And I think most of the important points have already been made, starting with Amba, yourself, talking about the, the kind of, conflicts of interests that are there in terms of, it is becoming a subject of trade in services, and we have seen that, under the WTO negotiations, how new subjects were brought under the canvas of trade in services, education, health, and so on. And all these things that we have discussed are actually part and parcel of that framework, whether it is students going abroad for education or institutions moving. There are, of course, hurdles in terms of national legislative frameworks which are coming in the way of how it should be dealt with, whether it should be part of the Education Ministry or it should be part of the Ministry of Commerce. So those are some of the considerations, but COVID has put us in a spot. COVID has made it important to look at various aspects of education in a disaggregated form, starting with issues of, somebody had mentioned about admission, but there are other issues like examination or grading. I mean, in fact, the United Kingdom is going through this issue of U-turn on grades, whether they should be awarded through some algorithm of what they had done in the classrooms earlier, or they should be assessed by their teachers. So, and this thing has been experienced by India also, because in terms of terminal students, how should they be assessed? Whether they should be, their internal assessment should be good enough, or whether that would be discriminatory, because many of the terminal students are going to become international students, and some of them have already been in the pipeline in terms of their overseas students' fees have been partly paid, their accommodations have been booked, and even travel tickets have been bought. So there is a kind of a logjam that the students are in. So I would like to put it that we are in uncertain times, and the level of anxiety is quite high, and that is universal. That, I think, is the characteristic of the education system, whether it is national system or international education. COVID has become omnipresent in the psyche of the people. Parents, teachers, students, administrators, all the stakeholders are actually affected by this. So I would not like to take more time because I know you are short of time, but certainly I have thoroughly enjoyed the discussion and one can build on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you all for this very interesting session. And actually, we touched upon so many issues. We touched upon this new trend of online education. Then there is a question of, then comes the question of exposure, the whole exposure that internationalization of education brings to students, that is lacking. And then there is also a question of how the lack of access to technology in several of the countries, so how they are going to challenge that, to face that. But within these frameworks, we also have a hope that the world will come back to its original self very soon, and I really hope so. And at that point, we will be again faced with the question of how much this international migration of students is helping the developing countries, even in terms of human capital, if we are talking about. But in case of India, we see most of them are settling in the destination countries only, So the whole idea of human capital building in such cases is partially is true only partially. So then those larger question comes, and then the whole question, actually student migration is a welcome trend in as far as cross pollination of ideas, etc. is concerned. But my point is only this, that why not developing countries can also be the destinations for international students. They can also be. And it was interesting to hear Ambassador Shobhan mention about Malaysia, how Malaysia is actually now attracting more and more Bangladeshi students. So that is also a trend that we should welcome. And any initiative of welcoming the foreign universities in developing countries to opening campuses, I think is a very welcome idea, because this whole idea of cross-pollination of ideas and exposure will then go to the larger populations, and that will be interesting, and that also creates a kind of vitality in the local education. I think so. So that's a very welcome trend, and only future will tell how this is going to develop. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here in this wonderful session. And in the end, I would like to invite Dr. Monica Bisht for proposing vote of thanks. Thank you. Monica?
Please unmute, Monica.
Yeah.
Yes, please unmute. Please unmute.
Thank you, ma'am. So, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the GRFPT, I am Monica Bisht, delighted to give a vote of thanks. It is challenging for me to give vote of thanks in few words, but I take this opportunity to give wholehearted thanks to the esteemed speakers, Professor Maria Amelia Viteria, Ambassador Nahida Shobhan, Dr. Alma Maldonado, Professor Luis Arnoldo Ordonez Vela, Dr. Anjali Sahai, Dr. Erica Sarmanto for this insightful discussion today. Respected speakers, your knowledge and ideas have enlightened us in the area of international student migration It was a great pleasure of listening to all of you, and we have indeed learned several dimensions of student migration, such as brain drain, the emergence of the aspiring students from middle class backgrounds in different parts of the world, online mode of teaching and learning mode, mental health, issues of financing for return students in the country of origin, from the purview of Latin America and Asia during the current phase of the COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 in the future trend of the student mobility. Thank you everyone for this exciting and informative panel discussion. It is my privilege to thank Dr. Amba Pandey for moderating this panel discussion in so organized and effective manner. I must appreciate it and give best wishes from the GRFPT team. I also like to thank all the participants, especially Professor Vinod Khadaria, Professor C.S. Bhatt, Dr. Raj Bardule, for giving your important input and for your kind participation in this webinar. Further, I apologize to the speakers if I have pronounced any of your names incorrectly. I extend my wholehearted thanks to all the researchers, young scholars, students from India and abroad who have participated in our webinar today. Many of have participated since beginning, and you are giving so much appreciation, support, and kind messages from across the world. And thank you for those words. Last but not the least, I extend my thanks to the organizers, especially the support team for their communication channels, for their assistance, as well as providing timely information in several social media platforms. Now let me inform you about our next virtual panel discussion. The title of the webinar is Employer Tied Visa. It will be hosted on 25th August 2020 at 5:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. We request you to kindly register via the given link and join us again in our next panel discussion. Now I have one more important information to announce here. I am very glad to inform you that the 4 organizations, that is Migrant Forum Asia, Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, GRFPT, and Civil Society Action Committee are organizing a 6-month online certificate course on Global Compact for Migration from October 2020 to March 2021 with collaboration. This course is aimed at providing an interdisciplinary and comprehensive approach to understand the human progress vis-a-vis migration and engage the learner in the various applied areas and act as a change agent. The minimum eligibility criteria for the participants is a bachelor's degree with good writing and speaking skills in English. The certificate course will have 16 credits and have no fees. Like our other panel discussions, this course will also be streamed via Zoom platform. We will open the registration link from 20th August till 28th August. The details will be provided with all of you soon, and we request to kindly circulate that poster among your colleagues, students, and young scholars. I request you to please follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel to know updates from our site. Details are available www.grfct.com. With this note, I close this webinar here. Good night from India.
And thank you, Professor Camelia. And we'll take some break actually, both CSAT and GRFDT. Then we'll come back again after having some, reflection on how it have, gone through and what next plan is. So we'll come back again. And thank you, Professor Camelia, for your company and all support you have given with all the participants, all the speakers from Latin American side. It was very enriching, and we look forward more collaboration with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.